In southern Iraq, beneath layers of wind-blown sand and the accumulated silence of 50 centuries, clay tablets rest in museum drawers and climate-controlled archives. Pressed into their surfaces, wedge-shaped marks spell out names that sound like whispers from another world. Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The question that has troubled minds for generations settles over these ancient words like dust. Were they gods of myth and metaphor, or were they something else entirely? And if the translations hold secrets we've misunderstood, what if the tablets don't describe an arrival at all, but an escape? Welcome. It might be late where you are, the kind of hour when questions grow larger, and the usual certainties feel further away. Thank you for being here, for lending your attention to this particular mystery that refuses to rest quietly in academic journals and museum catalogues. The cuneiform tablets discovered across Mesopotamia over the past 2 centuries present us with humanity's oldest written narratives. Among them, texts describe beings called the Anunnaki, divine figures who descended from the heavens and shaped the earliest civilization we can document through archaeology. Mainstream scholars read these as pure mythology, religious literature from a polytheistic culture trying to explain cosmic origins and divine hierarchies. The academic consensus treats these stories the way we might treat Greek myths about Zeus and Hera, powerful narratives that reveal cultural values, not historical records of actual events. But in 1976, a scholar named Zecharia Sitchin published a different interpretation. He argued that the Sumerian texts, when read with fresh eyes and alternative translations, described not gods but extraterrestrial visitors, ancient astronauts who came to Earth for specific purposes, who genetically modified primitive humans, who left traces in our oldest stories. His work sparked decades of debate, inspired countless books and documentaries, and divided readers into camps, those who found his evidence compelling and those who found it unfounded. Here's what matters for our purposes tonight. We're not here to prove one interpretation correct and dismiss the other. We're here to explore what the tablets actually say, what archaeologists have actually found, and why this question captivates us regardless of which answer we favor. The wonder isn't diminished by uncertainty. If anything, it deepens. Take a breath. Where are you right now? Perhaps in bed with the lights already low, or settled into a favorite chair as the house grows quiet around you. Let your shoulders drop slightly. Let the weight you've been carrying all day begin to transfer into whatever surface supports you now. If you're finding value in this exploration, a like or subscription helps others discover these journeys into ancient mysteries. We're grateful you're here. Now then, picture those tablets as they were found, not in their moment of creation, but in their moment of rediscovery. 19th century archaeologists working in desert heat, brushing sand from fractured clay, seeing wedge marks emerge that no one had read in millennia. The tablets came from collapsed libraries, from temple archives, from the ruins of cities whose names had been forgotten until shovels broke through palace floors. Nineveh, Nippur, Udafor. Each excavation season brought more fragments, more narratives, more glimpses into a civilization that invented writing itself and used it to record their understanding of cosmic order. The texts speak of creation and flood, of cities built by divine command, of humans fashioned from clay and divine breath to serve as workers for immortal beings. They describe the Anunnaki Council, their hierarchies and conflicts, their relationships with humanity, tablet after tablet, story after story, building a cosmology as complex as any mythology we know, or, if you follow the alternative interpretation, building a historical record we've simply failed to recognize as such. Either way, the question glows in the dark like embers. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? What did they witness or remember or imagine that compelled them to press these particular words into clay and fire them into permanence? And beneath that question, another. If we've misread the translations, if certain words mean something other than what we've assumed, what story actually unfolds in those wedge-shaped marks? Not arrival as conquerors or benefactors, but flight as refugees, not descent as choice, but escape as necessity. The tablets wait in their drawers, patient as stone, holding their secrets in shapes that look like bird tracks fossilized in mud. What they describe happened, or was imagined, at the very dawn of recorded time, before iron, before bronze, before the wheel spread beyond Mesopotamia, when the world's first cities were rising from marshland, and humanity was learning what it meant to live in permanent settlements under the governance of priest-kings who claimed divine mandate. We're going back there now, not to those museum drawers, but further, back to the world that existed before the Sumerians, before the tablets, before the question of the Anunnaki could even be asked because writing hadn't yet been invented to hold such questions. Back to the landscape itself, to the rivers and the climate, and the deep time that shaped everything that followed. The stars above that ancient land still wheel in their courses. The same constellations the Sumerians named and mapped and wove into their cosmology. Settle deeper into comfort. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. We have time and distance to cross. 12,000 years ago, the land between two rivers didn't yet have a name. Ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for 100 millennia were retreating, melting into oceans that rose and swallowed coastlines. The planet warmed at speeds that seemed glacial to any human lifetime, but represented breakneck transformation in geological terms. Where tundra had stretched, forests advanced. Where permafrost had locked the ground solid, springs bubbled forth, and rivers began carving new channels toward distant seas. This was the early Holocene, the epoch we still inhabit, and it arrived with violence softened only by the passage of centuries. In what would become southern Iraq, meltwater from the Zagros Mountains to the northeast and the Taurus Range to the northwest carved deeper valleys, widened floodplains, built deltas that extended into the Persian Gulf. The Tigris and Euphrates, names they wouldn't carry for thousands of years yet, flowed through landscapes still adjusting to the absence of Ice Age cold. Seasonal flooding followed patterns that changed with each passing century, as climate found new equilibrium. The rivers meandered, shifted course, abandoned old channels and carved new ones through soil that had never known cultivation. Marshlands spread across the lower reaches where the gradient flattened and water slowed. Reed beds thick enough to hide entire communities grew in seasonal wetlands that stretched for kilometers. Fish spawned in shallow waters warmed by longer summers. Migrating birds found refuge in these marshes during journeys between continents. Following routes established over millennia, the land here sat barely above sea level, subject to the moods of both rivers and tides, a liminal zone where earth and water negotiated boundaries that shifted with every flood season. No cities rose from these plains yet, no temples crowned artificial hills. The humans who moved through this landscape left traces we struggle to interpret. Temporary camps, scattered tool assemblages, middens marking places where shellfish were harvested and consumed. They were hunter-gatherers transitioning towards something new, though they couldn't have known what that transition would ultimately produce. Perhaps they noticed patterns in wild grain growth, the way certain stands returned thicker after accidental fires cleared competing vegetation. Perhaps they began protecting these patches, visiting them seasonally, eventually staying longer. Temperature records extracted from ice cores and lake sediments show the warming accelerating between 11,000 and 9,000 years ago. This period, called the Holocene climatic optimum by climate scientists, brought conditions warmer and wetter than what we experience today. The Fertile Crescent earned its eventual name during these centuries, when rainfall supported vegetation that could feed large animal populations, which in turn could feed human populations growing in numbers and confidence. The night sky above this transforming landscape displayed constellations we would still recognize. Orion's belt marked the celestial equator. The Pleiades cluster, which Mesopotamians would later call the Seven Sisters, rose in late spring. Venus blazed as morning and evening star, its movements through the zodiac following patterns that seemed regular once you watched long enough. Already, before writing, before cities, people were tracking these lights. We find alignments in structures much older than Sumer, suggesting that observation of celestial phenomena preceded the recording of such observations by many thousands of years. When the summer solstice arrived, the sun rose at its northernmost point on the horizon, before beginning its slow journey southward again. When winter solstice came, darkness dominated, and the sun seemed weak, reluctant to climb far above the southern horizon. These were the rhythms that structured experience, more reliable than weather, more certain than the floods that could arrive early or late but always arrived. Sky patterns didn't change the way earthly patterns did. They endured. The soil here carried salt, water evaporating in the heat left behind mineral residues that accumulated over seasons. This would eventually matter enormously. Salinization would contribute to agricultural collapse thousands of years in the future, but for now it was simply one more characteristic of a challenging environment. Hot summers, mild winters, unpredictable floods, soils that required careful management. Not an easy place to establish permanent settlement, but possible for people who watched closely and learned what the land offered and demanded in return. Consider how long this period lasted. 6,000 years separate the end of the Ice Age from the first recognizable Sumerian settlements. That's longer than the span between the construction of the Great Pyramid and the present day. Generations upon generations living, learning, adapting to an environment that was itself still finding stability. Stories passed through oral tradition during this time. How many we can't know. Origin stories, flood stories, stories of ancestors, and spirits and forces beyond human control. None of them preserved in writing, because writing didn't exist yet, but memory persisted. Memory of cataclysmic changes when the ice retreated, memory of coastlines drowned when seas rose, memory of winters that slowly became less severe and summers that brought new abundance. These memories would eventually be encoded in the myths that would be encoded in the tablets we're trying to understand. Flood narratives that echo across cultures might preserve genuine recollection of ice age melting and sea level rise. The question of how far back collective memory can reach remains open, debated, unresolved. By 6000 BCE, permanent villages were established in the region. Mud brick architecture, domesticated grains, herded animals, the Neolithic Revolution, as archaeologists call it, transforming human existence from mobile hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture and animal husbandry. This transition happened at different times in different places, but here in Mesopotamia, it was gaining momentum, setting the stage for everything that followed. The land was ready, the climate had stabilized enough to support consistent agriculture, the rivers provided water, transportation, and fertile silt after floods. Wild resources remained abundant enough to supplement cultivation and herding. Humans had learnt through millennia of trial and error what grew well, what animals could be managed, what materials served for building and tools. What came next would transform not just this region, but eventually the entire world. Cities would rise, writing would be invented, complex hierarchies would develop, along with specialized labor, monumental architecture, sophisticated art, and astronomical knowledge that still impresses us today. And woven through the texts those civilizations produced would be stories of beings who came from the heavens, bringing knowledge and demanding service. But that emergence still lay in the future. First, the foundations had to be laid in mud and reeds, and gradually accumulating knowledge passed from one generation to the next, each learning slightly more than their parents knew, each pushing a little further toward permanence, in a landscape that had known only movement for so long. Language existed, obviously, complex, nuanced, capable of expressing abstractions and narratives and arguments. Humans were fully modern cognitively by this point, their brains identical in structure and capacity to ours. They told stories around fires, taught children through verbal instruction, negotiated social relationships through conversation. What they couldn't do was make any of it permanent. Everything lived only in memory and speech. A story told tonight might be remembered tomorrow, but how accurately? A lesson taught to children might be passed to grandchildren, but with what alterations? Over generations, over centuries, information flowed like water through cupped hands, some of it retained, most of it eventually lost, all of it subject to the limitations and distortions inherent in oral tradition. This limitation shaped knowledge in profound ways. What could be remembered had to be memorable. Structured in patterns, embedded in narratives, connected to ritual practices that reinforced retention. Poetry predates prose for practical reasons. Rhythm and repetition serve as mnemonic devices, making complex information more likely to survive transmission. The epics we eventually find written in cuneiform probably began as oral compositions, refined over countless retellings before anyone pressed them into clay. Specialized knowledge stayed with specialists. Craftspeople guarded techniques as valuable possessions, teaching apprentices directly, maintaining control through secrecy. Astronomical observations might be tracked by particular lineages or priesthoods. Their knowledge passed vertically through time but restricted horizontally across society. Writing would eventually democratize information in ways that would have seemed dangerous or impossible to proliferate cultures. But that was still millennia away. What stories did they tell in those villages between 6000 and 4000 BCE? We can only guess based on what survived into written form later. Creation myths, probably. Explanations for how the world came to be, where humans came from, why things are the way they are. Flood stories, almost certainly. Anyone living in flood-prone river valleys would accumulate memories of particularly devastating inundations that destroyed settlements and displaced populations. Hero tales, describing ancestors who accomplished remarkable deeds or survived impossible challenges. And perhaps, this is speculation, but grounded speculation, stories of visitors or interventions by powerful beings. Every culture develops narratives about gods or spirits or forces greater than human. These narratives serve social functions, explaining the inexplicable and providing frameworks for ritual and moral behavior. When writing finally appears in Sumer, the tablets immediately contain fully developed mythologies featuring complex divine hierarchies. That complexity didn't emerge overnight. It must have been refined through centuries of oral tradition before anyone thought to record it permanently. The Anunnaki appear in the earliest written texts as an established concept, their roles and relationships already defined. This suggests the mythology predates literacy by substantial margins. How long? Impossible to say with certainty. But the sophistication of the narratives, the interconnected relationships between deities, the detailed cosmology, all of it points to long development before crystallization in written form. Consider what's lost in that silence. Not just Mesopotamian stories, but all the stories from all the cultures that never developed writing, or developed it too late to capture their earlier traditions, or had their written records destroyed before modern archaeology could recover them. The vast majority of human experience, thought, and creative expression has vanished without trace. What we have in those clay tablets represents an infinitesimally small sample of what was actually thought, believed, and communicated in ancient Mesopotamia. The summer Milky Way arced overhead in those millennia, the same river of stars visible from any location with dark skies. Venus followed its peculiar pattern of appearing as evening star for several months, disappearing, then reappearing as morning star. Mars moved forward against background stars, then mysteriously reversed direction before continuing onward, a phenomenon called retrograde motion that puzzled observers until Copernicus explained it, through heliocentric geometry, thousands of years later. Jupiter's steady progression through the zodiac took roughly 12 years for a complete circuit, while Saturn required nearly 30. These patterns were noticed. We know from later astronomical texts that Mesopotamians tracked planetary movements with impressive precision. Such knowledge required sustained observation over many generations. Records passed somehow from one observer to the next. Without writing, how did they maintain accuracy? Perhaps through marked stones or poles aligned to specific horizon positions. Perhaps through song or poetry encoding numerical relationships. Perhaps through systems we can't reconstruct because they left no archaeological trace. The question of how sophisticated preliterate astronomy could become remains open. Stonehenge in Britain, predating Sumerian writing by over 1,000 years, demonstrates precise astronomical alignments requiring generations of observation and adjustment. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, even older, shows carved pillars with symbols that might encode astronomical information, though we can't yet read them with confidence. Knowledge could accumulate without writing, but the margin for error was much larger and the process of transmission much more fragile. When drought came, or plague, or invaders, knowledge could vanish in a generation if the lineages maintaining it were disrupted. This vulnerability meant that oral cultures probably experienced repeated cycles of advancement and loss, building understanding slowly over good periods, and losing it rapidly during catastrophes. Writing would change this equation fundamentally. The villages grew larger. Some by 5000 BCE could be called towns, with populations in the hundreds rather than dozens. Social complexity increased accordingly. More specialized roles, more hierarchical organization, more need for coordination and record-keeping. Trade networks extended across the region and beyond. Obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Persian Gulf, copper from sources in the highlands. Objects moved between communities, carrying with them ideas and techniques and possibly stories. Perhaps traders brought tales of other lands, other peoples, other ways of organizing society and explaining the cosmos. Perhaps these encounters enriched local mythologies, introducing new elements that would be incorporated into evolving narratives about divine beings and cosmic order. Cross-cultural exchange predates writing by millennia. The mythologies we eventually find recorded in different regions share enough similarities, flood stories, divine councils, cosmic battles, to suggest either common origins or long-standing contact between cultures. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of language, thought, creativity, and knowledge. But it was vulnerable in ways that literacy would partially remedy. When the first stylus pressed into the first tablet, creating the first permanent record that could outlast memory, something fundamental shifted. The relationship between past and present changed. Authority could be invoked by reference to ancient texts. Contracts could be enforced across time. Astronomical observations could be compared across generations with precision. That moment approached. The social and economic complexity of Mesopotamian settlements was reaching a point where some form of external memory storage became not just useful but necessary. Accounting for stored grain, tracking ownership of animals, recording debts and obligations, these practical needs would drive the invention that would eventually preserve stories about divine beings called the Anunnaki. But first, the infrastructure. First, the cities themselves had to rise. Around 4000 BCE, settlement patterns in southern Mesopotamia began shifting towards something unprecedented. Villages that had existed for centuries started growing rapidly, populations concentrating in a few key locations rather than remaining dispersed across the landscape. Uruk, which would become the world's first true city, was emerging from marshland and agricultural fields, its population expanding beyond anything previously seen in human history. This concentration required new forms of organization. When a few dozen people live together, social bonds and personal relationships can manage most coordination. When thousands live together, different systems become necessary. Authority needs to be established and maintained. Resources need to be collected, stored and distributed. Disputes need resolution mechanisms beyond personal negotiation. The infrastructure of civilization, not just physical infrastructure, but social, political and ideological infrastructure, had to be constructed alongside the buildings and walls and temples. Temple complexes provided focal points for emerging urban societies. Raised platforms built from sun-dried mud brick created artificial hills where natural elevation barely existed. These platforms supported structures serving both religious and administrative functions, the two categories not yet clearly separated. Priests who conducted rituals also managed storehouses, organized labor for public works, and maintained knowledge that gave them authority. The line between sacred and secular would have seemed meaningless or non-existent to people for whom cosmic order and social order were inseparably linked. Managing the resources of a growing city required keeping track of quantities and transactions beyond what human memory could reliably handle. Initially, small clay tokens in various shapes, cones, spheres, discs, served as physical representations of commodities. A cone might represent a measure of grain, a sphere might represent a jar of oil. These tokens could be enclosed in clay envelopes to create sealed records of transactions, but this system had limitations, particularly around verification and modification. The breakthrough came when someone realized you could press the tokens into the surface of the clay envelope before sealing them inside, creating a record of the contents visible on the exterior. From there, a short conceptual leap led to abandoning the tokens entirely and simply inscribing marks on clay tablets. These marks, made with reed styluses that left wedge-shaped impressions, became cuneiform, from Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. The earliest tablets, dating to around 3400 BCE, are purely administrative, lists of goods, quantities, personal names functioning as labels for responsible parties, nothing we would call literature or mythology. The technology was being developed for practical economic purposes, not for preserving stories, but once the technology existed, its potential applications expanded. Clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia. Riverine deposits provided unlimited raw material that could be shaped when wet and hardened through sun-drying or firing. A tablet could be inscribed while soft, then dried for permanent storage. Mistakes could be smoothed away before drying. Finished tablets were durable enough to survive millennia if conditions were right, protected from moisture, buried in collapsed buildings, sometimes baked hard by fires that destroyed the structures containing them. The physical act of inscription requires consideration. Holding a reed stylus at an angle to soft clay, pressing wedges in sequence to build up characters, composing text line by line across the tablet's surface. The process was slow, demanding attention and skill. Scribal training took years. Students practiced on tablets that could be recycled, smoothing them flat to start again, building muscle memory for the hundreds of signs required to write Sumerian competently. Writing systems don't spring forth fully developed. Early cuneiform was pictographic, simplified drawings representing objects or concepts. Over centuries, these pictures evolved into increasingly abstract combinations of wedges, until the connection to original pictorial origins became nearly unrecognizable. The sign for sun started as a circle with rays, but by 2000 BCE it looked nothing like a sun, just a specific arrangement of wedge marks that scribes learned through rote memorization and practice. Sumerian, the language first recorded in cuneiform, has no known relatives. It's a linguistic isolate, unrelated to the Semitic languages that would later dominate the region. Its grammar follows patterns that seem alien to speakers of Indo-European or Semitic languages, agglutinative, with meaning built through chains of suffixes, and syntactic structures that place verbs at the end of clauses. Learning to read it now requires years of specialized training, and even expert translators encounter ambiguities and passages whose meaning remains disputed. This matters because the stories of the Anunnaki come to us through this particular linguistic medium. Translation introduces uncertainty. Single words in Sumerian might carry multiple meanings depending on context, and means heaven or sky, but also serves as the name of a major deity. Ki means earth, and also functions as a divine name. Anunnaki breaks down to Anunnaki, those of heavenly blood, or those who from heaven came, or princely offspring, depending on how you interpret the components. Each translation choice shapes how we understand the texts. By 2700 BCE, cuneiform had evolved to record not just accounting, but literature, hymns, royal inscriptions, legal codes, and mythological narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, probably the world's oldest surviving work of narrative literature, takes form during this period. Stories of creation and flood, of divine conflicts and cosmic order, begin appearing on tablets. These narratives don't announce themselves as new inventions. They're presented as if already known, suggesting oral traditions finally being committed to permanent record. The tablets that describe the Anunnaki most clearly come from slightly later periods. Old Babylonian texts from around 1800 BCE, Neo-Assyrian copies from 700 BCE, but they're copying and interpreting earlier traditions, sometimes explicitly referencing ancient originals. The scribes themselves saw their work as preservation, not creation. They were writing down what had been known, what had been passed through generations, what their ancestors had understood about the gods and cosmic order. Imagine the scribe bent over his tablet in the temple scriptorium, stylus in hand, pressing symbols into damp clay, while outside the city bustles with marketplace noise and agricultural labor. He's transcribing a myth about divine beings descending from heaven, fashioning humans from clay mixed with divine blood, setting mortals to work maintaining the earth. Does he believe this literally? Does he understand it metaphorically? Does the distinction even occur to him? We can't know his internal state, can only read the words he left pressed in clay. Those tablets, thousands of them, survived because the buildings that housed them collapsed and buried them, or because fires baked them hard, or because they were carefully stored in favorable conditions. Most didn't survive. Tablets left exposed to elements dissolved back to mud, libraries burned or were deliberately destroyed by conquering armies. The percentage of ancient Mesopotamian texts that have come down to us is vanishingly small. Estimates suggest we've recovered less than 1% of what was written. Within that surviving fraction, we find enough mentions of the Anunnaki to reconstruct their basic role in Sumerian cosmology. They're described as a group of deities, sometimes numbering 50, sometimes said to be 7 who decree fate, sometimes referenced as judges of the underworld. Their exact number and function varies between texts, suggesting either evolving traditions or different regional interpretations being recorded by different scribes in different periods. What we don't find is a clear systematic account explaining who they were, where they came from, and what their relationship to humanity was meant to be. The information comes in fragments, references, passing mentions within larger narratives focused on other topics. This incompleteness invites interpretation, speculation, and the construction of coherent theories from incomplete evidence. It creates space for alternative readings like Sitchins, which attempt to assemble scattered references into unified narratives the original texts never quite provide. The tablets themselves rest now in museums, research institutions, private collections, catalogued, photographed, some translated and published, others still awaiting scholarly attention. They're physical objects, holding weight, showing cracks and chips where edges broke away, bearing fingerprints of the scribes who shaped them. Touching one creates a strange connection across time, your fingers resting where ancient fingers rested, both of you interacting with the same clay that holds the same words. Those words spoke of gods and heaven and earth and the creation of humans. What exactly they meant to say, and whether we've understood them correctly, remains partly open. The silence before writing preserved mysteries. Writing preserves different mysteries, not absence of information, but presence of information whose meaning shifts depending on how you read it. The cities were rising now, full and real. The stage was set for the civilization that would dominate Mesopotamia for millennia, whose achievements and mysteries still command our attention across 5,000 years of intervening history. Uruk, around 3,500 BCE, covered roughly 250 hectares and housed perhaps 40,000 people, numbers that seem modest by modern standards, but represented an unprecedented concentration of humanity. The city spread across former marshland, its foundation levels built up through generations of collapsed mud brick structures that created artificial elevation above the floodplain. Archaeological excavations reveal layer upon layer of occupation, each stratum marking a distinct period of construction, use, and eventual abandonment or rebuilding. The temple precinct dominated the urban landscape. Excavators working in the 1920s and 30s uncovered massive platforms supporting structures that evolved over centuries. The White Temple, named for the gypsum plaster coating its exterior, sat atop a ziggurat rising approximately 13 meters above ground level. Access came through a series of ramps and stairs, the ascent itself becoming a ritual procession that moved worshippers from earthly realm toward divine space. Inside, a central chamber measuring roughly 17 by 22 meters contained an altar and offering table, while smaller rooms flanked the main space for storage and priestly activities. Evidence of specialized craft production appears throughout residential districts. Potter's wheels, bronze-working facilities, textile workshops organized into what might be called industrial sectors. The economy had differentiated beyond simple agriculture into complex interdependence. Some people produced food, others manufactured goods, still others administered, traded, defended, or performed ritual functions. This specialization generated wealth and social stratification, visible in housing variations, large compounds with multiple rooms versus small single-room structures, elaborate burials versus simple interments. Cylinder seals begin appearing in archaeological contexts from this period. These small stone cylinders, usually 2–4 centimeters in length, were carved with intricate designs that could be rolled across soft clay to leave continuous impressions. They served as signatures, identifying marks of authority or ownership. The imagery carved into them provides glimpses of early Mesopotamian worldview, processions of animals, human figures interacting with divine symbols, boats navigating stylized water, architectural elements suggesting temples or palaces. Some cylinder seals from slightly later periods show remarkable astronomical content, stars, planets represented by specific symbols, possible depictions of constellations. One famous seal, now in the Berlin Museum, shows a central sun-like figure surrounded by what appear to be planetary bodies in orbital arrangement. Alternative interpretations of this seal have sparked considerable debate, some seeing it as evidence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist this early, others reading it as purely mythological symbolism, with no connection to actual celestial observation. The debate touches on broader questions about what ancient peoples knew and how they came to know it. Did Mesopotamian astronomers independently develop heliocentric understanding millennia before Copernicus? The academic consensus says no, that apparent heliocentrism in artwork reflects symbolic rather than scientific representation. But the precision of later Mesopotamian astronomical calculations, their ability to predict eclipses and track planetary movements, suggests observational sophistication that developed from earlier foundations we can only partially reconstruct. City walls appeared during Uruk period, massive mud brick fortifications enclosing urban centers. These walls served practical defensive purposes, but also marked symbolic boundaries between civilized interior space and chaotic exterior wilderness. To live inside was to participate in ordered society, under divine and royal protection. To live outside was to exist in zones where different rules applied, where dangers both natural and supernatural held greater sway. Trade networks extended across remarkable distances. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, timber from Lebanon, obsidian from Anatolia. These materials appear in Uruk contexts thousands of kilometers from their sources, indicating either direct long-distance trade or complex chains of exchange linking distant regions. With trade came information flow. Techniques, ideas, stories, religious concepts, all could move along routes that carried physical goods. Population growth continued. Uruk may have reached 80,000 residents by 2900 BCE, making it arguably the largest city in the world at that time. This growth required increasing agricultural intensification in surrounding territories. Irrigation systems expanded, channeling river water to fields that would otherwise receive insufficient rainfall. The sophisticated hydraulic engineering involved digging and maintaining canals, constructing dams and weirs, managing water allocation between competing users. This infrastructure required coordination across many communities, creating incentives for political unification under authorities who could organize and enforce collective labor. Royal authority emerges clearly in the archaeological record by the early dynastic period, around 2900 to 2350 BCE. Cylinder seals now include cuneiform inscriptions naming kings and describing their deeds. Royal tombs at sites like Ur contain spectacular wealth, golden vessels, lapis lazuli jewelry, elaborate headdresses, and evidence of human sacrifice with dozens of attendants buried alongside their rulers. These tombs demonstrate both the concentration of resources in elite hands and belief systems that expected continued service in afterlife realms. The relationship between royal and divine authority appears thoroughly intertwined. Kings claimed divine mandate, sometimes divine descent, often divine selection for their roles. Temple economies and palace economies functioned in parallel, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes in tension. High priests wielded significant political power. Kings performed ritual functions. The categories we might separate into religious and political spheres existed in Mesopotamian thought as aspects of unified cosmic order. Architecture from this period shows increasing sophistication. Corbelled arches, drainage systems, multi-story structures with interior courtyards. The engineering knowledge required to construct buildings that could support their own weight while providing usable interior space had been developed through generations of trial and error. Failures, walls that buckled, roofs that collapsed, taught lessons incorporated into subsequent designs. Artistic conventions became standardized across the region. Specific ways of representing human figures, animals, divine symbols. These conventions weren't rigid, but showed enough consistency to suggest shared training, possibly scribal schools where craftspeople learnt established techniques alongside writing and mathematics. The standardization facilitated communication across cultures that might speak different languages but could recognize similar visual grammar. Within this context of emerging urban civilization, complex religious hierarchies, and long-distance trade, the stories that would later be written down were taking shape. The temples already stood when writing appeared. The rituals already ancient by the time anyone recorded them on clay. What the priests taught and what the people believed about divine origins, cosmic order, and humanity's place within that order had been refined through centuries of oral tradition before the first permanent records captured fragments of it. The cities rose from marshland and became centers of unprecedented human achievement. Knowledge accumulated, astronomical, mathematical, architectural, agricultural, social complexity deepened, creating hierarchies and specializations that would become standard features of civilization. And somewhere within this flourishing urban culture, stories were told about the Anunnaki, about divine beings who had shaped the world and created humanity for purposes those humans were still trying to understand. The archive rooms at Nippur, excavated by the University of Pennsylvania between 1889 and 1900, yielded approximately 50,000 tablets and fragments. Most dealt with mundane matters, accounting records, legal contracts, administrative correspondence, but scattered among the economic documents were literary and religious texts that would transform understanding of ancient Mesopotamian culture and mythology. Among these discoveries was a creation text now catalogued as CBS 10673, a tablet measuring roughly 15 by 10 centimeters, inscribed with Sumerian cuneiform, describing the separation of heaven and earth, the creation of humans, and the roles of various deities in cosmic ordering. The text mentions the Anunnaki explicitly, describing them as great gods who decree fates, who organize the cosmos according to divine plan. The tablet itself dates to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, but scholars recognize it as a copy of much older material, probably originally composed during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, perhaps earlier. Reading the text requires navigating layers of interpretation. Sumerian words often carry multiple meanings, and scribal conventions allowed for wordplay and double meanings that modern translators struggle to capture. The term Anunnaki appears consistently across multiple texts, but with varying grammatical constructions and contextual implications. Sometimes they function as a collective noun referring to the gods in general. Sometimes they represent a specific subset of deities distinct from the Agigi, another divine category mentioned in parallel. Sometimes they're associated with the underworld, other times with cosmic decree from heaven. The Eridu Genesis, another text known from multiple fragmentary copies, presents an earlier account of creation and flood. Here the god Enki warns the pious king Zeo-Sudra of coming deluge, instructing him to build a boat to preserve life. The parallels to the biblical Noah story are unmistakable, though the Mesopotamian version predates Genesis by over a millennium. Within this narrative, the Anunnaki appear as divine council members who decide humanity's fate, debating whether to destroy humankind through flood or preserve a remnant for repopulation. Translation of one passage illustrates the interpretive challenges. The Sumerian reads approximately Anunnaki Nean Kia Nam Tari Es. Word by word this breaks down as Anunnaki the heaven earth in fate decree. A conventional translation renders this, the Anunnaki decreed fate in heaven and earth, but alternative readings are possible depending on how you understand Anki as a compound. Does it mean heaven and earth as separate domains, or does it reference a primordial undivided state before cosmic separation? The grammatical ambiguity allows multiple interpretations. Sitchin's controversial readings often hinge on just such ambiguities, where conventional scholarship reads mythological descriptions of divine procreation and cosmic ordering. He reads historical accounts of genetic engineering and planetary colonization. The text says Enki mixed clay with divine blood to create humans. Standard interpretation, a metaphorical account of divine creative power and the semi-divine nature of humanity. Sitchin's interpretation, a literal description of genetic modification combining terrestrial hominid DNA with extraterrestrial genetic material, which reading the original authors intended remains fundamentally uncertain. Ancient peoples didn't draw sharp distinctions between literal and metaphorical truth, the way modern readers do. Their worldview permitted, perhaps even required, multiple layers of meaning to coexist. A text could simultaneously describe divine action and encode astronomical observation, represent historical memory, and communicate theological doctrine. Insisting on single correct interpretations may impose modern categorical thinking onto ancient texts that operated by different rules. The Atrahasis epic, known from versions spanning nearly 1,000 years, provides the most detailed account of human creation by the Anunnaki. According to this text, the gods divided into two groups: the Anunnaki, who were great gods, and the Igigi, who performed the labor of maintaining the world. After 40 years, the text is specific about this duration. The Igigi rebelled, refusing to continue their toil. The Anunnaki Council, led by Enlil, Anu, and Enki, debated solutions. Enki proposed creating humans to assume the labor burden, fashioning them from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god named Wielu, or Geshu-A, whose name means intelligence, or one who has understanding. This narrative raises questions regardless of how one interprets it. If read mythologically, why does it emphasize labor and rebellion rather than worship and devotion? Most creation myths explain why humans should revere the gods. This one explains why humans exist to work for the gods, describing humanity's origin not as gift but as solution to divine labor shortage. If read as Sitchin-style historical allegory, the specificity becomes even more puzzling. Why 40 years? Why genetic admixture? Why create an entire species rather than developing mechanical solutions? The text continues with accounts of human overpopulation prompting divine attempts to reduce numbers through plague, drought, and finally flood. Only the intervention of the dissenting god Enki, who warns Atrahasis and instructs him to build a boat, preserves humanity from complete extinction. After the flood, the Anunnaki Council implements measures to control human reproduction, including infant mortality, celibate priestesses, and demonic entities that cause miscarriages. Read as mythology. This explains the presence of suffering and death in human experience. Read alternatively. It might describe population control measures implemented by advanced beings managing a created species. Other texts add complexity to the picture. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic composed around 1100 BCE, mentions the Anunnaki in passing, but focuses primarily on Marduk's rise to supremacy among the gods. The Descent of Inanna describes Anunnaki as judges in the underworld, deciding the fates of the dead. Royal hymns from various periods invoke the Anunnaki as witnesses to treaties and guarantors of cosmic justice. Each text uses the term slightly differently, suggesting either evolving understanding across centuries or regional variations in tradition. Cylinder seals and relief sculptures provide visual complement to textual descriptions. Divine figures appear with wings, horned headdresses indicating divine status, often surrounded by star symbols or holding objects suggesting measurement and calculation. One famous seal impression shows a figure with wings hovering above reclining humans in what might be creation scene or divine instruction. Another depicts a procession of 7 robed figures beneath stellar symbols, possibly representing the 7 Anunnaki, who decree fate mentioned in multiple texts. The British Museum houses a boundary stone, called a kuduru, dating to the 12th century BCE, inscribed with symbols representing major deities including several Anunnaki figures. These symbols, star for Ishtar, crescent for Sin, winged disc for Shamash, connected specific gods to celestial phenomena. The association between divinity and celestial objects was fundamental to Mesopotamian religious thought. Gods weren't merely imagined as dwelling in heaven. They were heaven, or at least the visible celestial phenomena were understood as manifestations of divine presence and power. This connection between gods and celestial bodies has fueled speculation about ancient astronomical knowledge. If the Anunnaki were associated with specific planets or stars, and if priests tracked those celestial objects with precision, demonstrated in later astronomical tablets, what level of understanding did they achieve? The Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa, a 17th century BCE text recording observations of Venus positions over 21 years, shows mathematical sophistication and systematic recording that required institutional continuity and specialized training. The question persists: how much did they actually know? How much have we correctly understood from the fragmentary records that survived? The tablets speak clearly about the existence of divine beings called Anunnaki, about their roles in creation and cosmic ordering, about their relationships with humanity. What they mean by all this, whether the authors understood themselves to be recording history, or composing mythology, or doing something our categories fail to capture, remains open to interpretation. Modern scholarship favors mythological readings, treating these texts as religious literature, expressing theological and philosophical ideas through narrative. Alternative researchers like Sitchin favor historical readings, treating the same texts as corrupted or metaphorical accounts of actual events involving actual beings. Both approaches bring assumptions about what's possible, what's plausible, what ancient peoples were capable of understanding and expressing. The tablets themselves don't resolve the debate. They simply preserve the words pressed into clay thousands of years ago by scribes working in temple scriptoriums, copying texts that were already old when they copied them, maintaining traditions whose origins had already faded into legendary past by the time anyone thought to write them down permanently. Hermann Hilprecht arrived at Nippur in 1889 as part of the University of Pennsylvania expedition, joining the systematic excavation of what had been ancient Sumer's religious center. The site covered roughly 135 hectares, with visible ruins rising from the plain suggesting substantial structures beneath accumulated sand and debris. Previous looters and unofficial diggers had disturbed some areas, but the systematic archaeological approach Hilprecht's team employed would document stratigraphy and context in ways that preserved interpretive value. The excavation focused initially on the ziggurat area and the temple of Enlil, chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon. Workmen, hired from local villages and supervised by trained archaeologists, removed centuries of windblown sand and collapsed architecture. The physical labor was substantial, moving soil with shovels and baskets, carefully cleaning around architectural features, documenting finds through photographs and sketches. The heat of summer made work nearly impossible. Dust penetrated everything, water supplies were limited, and relations with local authorities required constant diplomatic attention. Within 3 seasons, they had uncovered the tablet archive mentioned earlier, thousands of texts documenting every aspect of Mesopotamian life. Hilprecht himself specialized in Sumerian epigraphy and spent long hours copying inscriptions, trying to make sense of texts whose language and script presented significant challenges. His notebooks, preserved in museum archives, show the painstaking process of comparing signs across different texts, building vocabulary lists, gradually assembling grammatical understanding of a dead language with no modern descendants. That discovery established a pattern repeated at sites across Mesopotamia over the following decades. Excavators at Uruk, Lagash, and dozens of other locations found similar archives, each adding to the corpus of known texts and filling gaps in understanding of Sumerian civilization. With each new tablet came opportunities to refine translations, test theories, and reconstruct the cultural context that produced these remarkable documents. The physical remains complemented textual evidence. Temple foundations revealed architectural features suggesting astronomical alignments. The ziggurat at excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, showed orientation approximately 45 degrees off cardinal directions, a choice that seemed deliberate but whose purpose remained unclear. Some scholars suggested it aligned with sunset on summer solstice. Others argued it reflected surveying conventions having nothing to do with celestial observation. The uncertainty persists because we lack clear textual evidence explaining the architect's intentions. Royal tombs at yielded spectacular grave goods, but also disturbing evidence of human sacrifice. In several tombs, dozens of attendants, servants, musicians, guards had been buried alive or poisoned to accompany their rulers into the afterlife. The individuals wore elaborate costumes and were arranged in careful poses, suggesting ritualized death rather than violent execution. What belief system justified this? How did the attendants themselves understand their fate? Texts provide some context, describing afterlife realms that mirrored earthly existence and required continued service, but the psychological and social dimensions of such practices remain partly beyond our reach. Artifacts challenged assumptions about technological capabilities. The famous gold helmet of Mes-Kalam-Dug, discovered in a tomb at demonstrates remarkable metallurgical skill. The helmet was hammered from a single sheet of gold, approximately 0.5 millimeters thick, shaped to fit the human head precisely, and decorated with embossed hair patterns and facial features. Creating such an object required sophisticated understanding of metal properties, heating and cooling cycles, and working techniques refined through generations of practice. The standard of a wooden box inlaid with lapis lazuli, shell, and red limestone, shows scenes of war and peace in intricate mosaic work. Each tiny piece was precisely cut and fitted into a bitumen-adhesive base, creating detailed narrative compositions. The craftsmanship involved would be impressive in any era. That it was produced around 2600 BCE, using tools far simpler than modern equivalents, suggests capabilities we sometimes underestimate when assessing ancient technological achievement. Stone vases found at various sites pose interesting questions. Some were carved from extremely hard stone, diorite, basalt, into forms with thin walls and smooth interiors that seem to exceed what could be achieved with copper tools available at the time. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate these objects using period-appropriate techniques. The attempts succeed but require enormous time investment and frequent tool replacement. This raises questions. Were techniques in use that we haven't recognized? Were tools employed that haven't survived in the archaeological record? Or did ancient craftspeople simply invest more time than we assume, accepting processes that we would consider inefficient? The archaeological record preserves what doesn't decay. Stone, fired clay, metals under favorable conditions. What it doesn't preserve is everything organic. Wood, textiles, leather, papyrus, foods, bodies, except in unusual preservation contexts. This means we see a systematically biased sample of ancient material culture, skewed toward durable materials. Entire categories of objects probably existed but left no trace. Sophisticated technologies might have been employed in perishable materials, rendering them invisible to archaeology. Dating ancient Mesopotamian sites relies on multiple lines of evidence. Pottery styles changed over time in recognizable patterns, allowing relative dating through ceramic typology. Architectural styles show similar evolution. Where texts are present, king lists and regnal years provide chronological frameworks. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials, when available, gives absolute dates with known margins of error. Comparing data from multiple methods builds confidence in chronological sequences. The date ranges archaeologists assign to Sumerian civilization rest on solid foundations for some periods, shakier ground for others. The early dynastic period 2900 to 2350 BCE has good chronological control through textual cross-references and consistent pottery sequences. The Uruk period before it, 4000–3100 BCE, has broader date ranges and more uncertainty because textual evidence is minimal and radiocarbon dates have wider confidence intervals. Scholarly consensus on these dates is strong but not absolute, and refinements continue as new evidence emerges. What archaeology cannot easily determine is the meaning ancient peoples assign to their creations. We can document temple orientations, but not definitively prove whether those orientations were intentional astronomical alignments or practical compromises with site topography. We can describe the iconography on cylinder seals, but not conclusively determine whether the imagery represents mythology, history, astronomical observation, or some combination we haven't considered. Physical evidence constrains interpretation, but doesn't eliminate ambiguity. This ambiguity creates space for alternative readings. When mainstream archaeology says a winged figure on a cylinder seal represents divine symbolism from mythological tradition, Sitchin-style interpretation asks whether it might represent actual flying craft or spacesuit technology. The physical evidence, the seal itself, remains constant. What changes is the framework of assumptions brought to interpreting that evidence. Academic archaeology operates within frameworks of cultural anthropology, comparative religion, and historical linguistics. These frameworks have been refined through decades of scholarship and generally produce coherent, internally consistent interpretations. Alternative archaeology operates within frameworks that allow for ancient contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, lost advanced civilizations, and catastrophic events not recognized by mainstream science. These frameworks also produce interpretations that seem coherent to their proponents. The fundamental question becomes, which framework better accounts for the totality of evidence? Mainstream scholars argue that conventional interpretations explain all known data without requiring unprecedented assumptions. Alternative researchers argue that conventional interpretations fail to explain certain anomalies and that fresh frameworks better account for puzzling details. The mainstream dismisses or explains away. The sites themselves remain open to continued investigation. Technologies improve, allowing new types of analysis. Ground-penetrating radar reveals subsurface features without excavation. Isotopic analysis of materials traces trade routes and sources. Digital imaging enhancement reveals details on worn inscriptions. Each technological advance offers opportunities to extract more information from finite archaeological resources, but extraction of information doesn't automatically resolve interpretive disputes. Two scholars examining the same ground-penetrating radar data might reach different conclusions about whether a subsurface anomaly represents an undiscovered chamber or natural geological variation. Two epigraphers reading the same damaged inscription might reconstruct missing text differently based on different assumptions about context and likely meaning. Evidence constrains but doesn't determine interpretation. The archaeological context for understanding the Anunnaki includes ruined temples and palaces, cylinder seals and boundary stones, thousands of tablets mentioning these divine beings in various capacities, and artistic depictions suggesting celestial associations. All of this is real, documented, studied extensively. What it means, whether it records mythology or misunderstood history, religious belief or corrupted memory of actual events, depends partly on evidence but also partly on the frameworks we bring to understanding that evidence. The excavations continue. Each season brings new discoveries, refinements to chronology, additions to the textual corpus. The conversation between past and present, between ancient voices and modern interpreters, remains ongoing. The Anunnaki wait in the texts, their nature and origin as mysterious now as when Hilprecht first read their names in tablet archives at Nippur over a century ago. Zakaria Sitchin was born in Baku, Azerbaijan in 1920, raised in Palestine, and eventually settled in New York, where he worked as a journalist and executive in the shipping industry. His academic background included economic history from the University of London, not archaeology or ancient Near Eastern studies. This outsider status would shape both his approach to Sumerian texts and the reception his theories received from established scholars. During the 1960s and early 70s, Sitchin began studying Sumerian, teaching himself from published dictionaries and grammar texts. He approached the material with fresh eyes, unburdened by conventional interpretive frameworks, but also lacking the deep contextual knowledge that comes from formal training in the field. What he saw in those ancient texts struck him as revolutionary. Where academic translators read mythology, he read historical accounts of extraterrestrial contact and genetic engineering. His first book, The 12th Planet, appeared in 1976 and presented a radical reinterpretation of Sumerian creation myths. The central claim, the Anunnaki were not gods, but physical beings from another planet in our solar system, a world Sitchin called Nibiru. According to his reading of the texts, this planet followed an elliptical orbit, taking 3,600 years to complete one circuit around the Sun, bringing it periodically close to Earth. During these approaches, the Anunnaki traveled to Earth, establishing colonies and eventually creating humans through genetic modification to serve as workers in mining operations. The academic response was swift and largely dismissive. Professional Sumerologists pointed out numerous translation errors in Sitchin's work. His reading of Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came was linguistically defensible, but many of his more specific claims rested on misunderstandings of Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. The word he translated as rocket ships appeared nowhere in the texts. The detailed descriptions of genetic engineering he extracted from creation myths required reading implications into text that said nothing of the sort explicitly. Yet Sitchin's work found an enormous popular audience. The 12th Planet sold millions of copies and spawned 13 additional books elaborating his theories. He tapped into existing fascination with ancient astronauts, a concept popularized by Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods in 1968. The idea that human civilization was jump-started by extraterrestrial visitors resonated with readers who found conventional explanations for ancient achievements unconvincing or who simply enjoyed alternative narratives challenging established authority. Sitchin argued that specific details in Sumerian texts described advanced technology. References to gods traveling in skyboats or celestial chambers became spacecraft in his interpretation. Descriptions of weapons that could destroy mountains became nuclear devices. The creation of humans from clay, mixed with divine blood, became genetic manipulation, combining hominid and alien DNA. Each reinterpretation built a comprehensive alternative history that explained not just Sumerian texts, but a wide range of ancient mysteries, from the precision of Egyptian pyramid construction, the astronomical knowledge preserved in various ancient cultures. The cosmology he extracted from his readings posited that Nibiru's orbit brought periodic catastrophes to Earth through gravitational effects and close encounters. The biblical flood, the destruction of Atlantis, climate shifts that ended ice ages, all could be explained by Nibiru's approach every 3,600 years. The Anunnaki themselves, according to Sitchin, lived vastly longer than humans because of different planetary conditions on their home world, explaining the extraordinary lifespans attributed to antediluvian kings in Sumerian king lists. Professional astronomers noted that Sitchin's proposed orbit for Nibiru was gravitationally unstable and would either eject from the solar system or collide with another body within a relatively short time frame. No astronomical observations support the existence of such a planet. Calculations of orbital mechanics showed that a body on the trajectory Sitchin described couldn't maintain that orbit for more than a few million years, far too brief for the hundreds of millions of years of stability required by his theory. Sitchin responded that mainstream science was too rigid in its thinking, unwilling to consider evidence that challenged established models. He pointed to anomalies in ancient texts, unexplained archaeological finds, and what he saw as patterns of knowledge transmission that conventional scholarship couldn't adequately explain. How did Sumerians know about planets not visible to the naked eye? How did they develop sophisticated mathematics seemingly overnight? Why did their king lists describe reigns of thousands or tens of thousands of years before the flood? The debate revealed fundamental differences in methodology. Academic scholarship builds understanding gradually, testing hypotheses against multiple lines of evidence, requiring peer review and replication. Sitchin's approach was more synthetic, looking for overarching narratives that could unite disparate pieces of information into coherent stories. He privileged textual evidence as literal history, while academic scholars privileged archaeological and comparative context to interpret those same texts as mythology. What neither side disputed was the genuine strangeness of some ancient knowledge. Mesopotamian astronomy did achieve remarkable precision. Mathematical texts from the Old Babylonian period show understanding of concepts including the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras, quadratic equations, and geometric series. Astronomical tablets track planetary positions with accuracy that required sustained observation over many generations. How exactly this knowledge developed, and whether it represents purely human achievement or some form of knowledge transfer, remained contentious. Sitchin's later books expanded his theories to encompass genetics, suggesting that the Anunnaki created humans by splicing their own genes into existing hominid populations. He pointed to the Genesis passage describing sons of God mating with daughters of men as evidence of ongoing genetic interaction between Anunnaki and humans. The rapid development of Homo sapiens, the relatively sudden appearance of civilization in Mesopotamia, the common flood narratives across cultures, all fit into his framework of extraterrestrial intervention in human development. Critics noted that modern genetics tells a different story. Human DNA shows clear evolutionary development from earlier hominids with no evidence of alien genetic material or sudden artificial modifications. The archaeological record shows gradual cultural development in Mesopotamia, not sudden appearance of civilization. Flood narratives are common, because floods are common catastrophes in river valleys where early civilizations developed. Each element of Sitchin's theory that seemed to require his explanation could be explained through conventional mechanisms if you didn't start with the assumption that ancient text recorded literal history. But assumptions matter. If you assume ancient peoples were capable observers recording what they witnessed, and if you assume extraterrestrial visitation is possible, and potentially likely given the age and size of the universe, then Sitchin's framework becomes more plausible. The same evidence that seems like mythology to conventional scholars becomes corrupted history to alternative interpreters. The gap between these positions isn't easily bridged, because the disagreement runs deeper than any specific translation or archaeological find. Sitchin passed away in 2010, but his theories continue to influence popular understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. Countless books, documentaries, and websites build on his work, elaborating and modifying his ideas. Some take his framework as settled fact and use it to interpret new discoveries. Others use his work as starting point for further speculation about ancient advanced civilizations, lost technologies, and hidden histories suppressed by academic orthodoxy. The academic establishment remains unconvinced. No Sumerian scholar of recognized standing has validated Sitchin's translations or endorsed his interpretations. Professional archaeologists working in Iraq and surrounding regions continue to find evidence consistent with gradual cultural development, not sudden appearance of advanced knowledge from external sources. The consensus hasn't shifted toward ancient astronaut theories despite decades of popular books presenting them. Yet the questions Sitchin raised retain their power. How did ancient peoples achieve what they achieved? What exactly did they mean by the stories they told? Could our assumptions about what's possible blind us to alternative explanations that better fit certain puzzling details? The conversation between mainstream and alternative archaeology continues, often acrimoniously, sometimes productively, but always revealing different ways of trying to make sense of human past. The tablets themselves remain silent on the dispute, holding their wedge-shaped secrets in clay that neither confirms nor denies radically different readings of the same ancient words. The standard narrative, both in mainstream scholarship and in Sitchin's framework, describes the Anunnaki as arriving on Earth intentionally. They came, established settlements, pursued their objectives, whether those were divine governance or gold mining, but some researchers exploring alternative interpretations have proposed a different reading of certain Sumerian passages. What if the texts don't describe purposeful colonization, but desperate flight? What if the Anunnaki didn't arrive as masters but escaped as refugees? This interpretation focuses on specific words and phrases in creation texts that might suggest urgency or necessity, rather than planned expedition. The Atrahasis epic describes the Anunnaki as originally performing difficult labor that they eventually rebelled against. If read differently, this might describe not gods who tired of work, but beings fleeing conditions that made their original home uninhabitable. The creation of humans to perform labor becomes not exploitation but necessity, survivors needing help to survive in new environment. Proponents of this view point to mythological references to cosmic catastrophe and conflict. The Enuma Elish describes a battle between Marduk and Tiamat, a primordial chaos monster associated with salt water. Mainstream scholars read this as mythological explanation for cosmic ordering and seasonal cycles. Sitchin read Tiamat as a planet destroyed in collision with Nibiru, creating the asteroid belt and Earth. But a third reading asks, could this describe a cosmic event that made the Anunnaki's home system uninhabitable, forcing evacuation to Earth? The implications shift dramatically depending on which interpretation you favor. Colonizers choosing to exploit a primitive world can leave when their mission completes. Refugees fleeing disaster have nowhere else to go. This might explain certain puzzling elements in the texts, why the Anunnaki seem so invested in Earth's survival, why they intervene repeatedly to prevent human extinction, why they appear to remain here rather than returning to their supposed home. Some passages describe the Anunnaki as establishing dwellings and setting up thrones, with language that could suggest permanence born of necessity rather than temporary occupation. The texts never clearly describe them leaving Earth and returning to celestial home. Instead, they seem to remain, gradually becoming more distant from human affairs, but never departing entirely. This pattern fits refugees, who've made irreversible commitment to new home, rather than colonizers who could return to origin. The escape hypothesis also reframes the flood narrative. In traditional reading, the gods send the flood to destroy noisy humanity. In Sitchin's framework, the flood results from natural catastrophe during Nibiru's approach, which the Anunnaki anticipate, but choose not to warn humanity about. But if the Anunnaki were themselves refugees from cosmic catastrophe, their response to the flood becomes more complex. Enki's decision to warn Ziusudra and save humanity might reflect not individual gods' compassion, but collective memory of their own near extinction, creating empathy that overrides the council's decision. Evidence for this interpretation remains circumstantial and depends heavily on reading implications into texts rather than explicit statements. No Sumerian tablet says clearly we fled our dying world and came here as refugees. The language is always mythological, describing divine action through metaphor and symbolism that permits multiple readings. But the same is true of every interpretation. Mainstream mythological readings, Sitchin's ancient astronaut framework, and this refugee hypothesis all rest partly on reading between lines of texts that never quite spell out everything they imply. Astronomical observations preserved in later Mesopotamian texts show sophisticated tracking of celestial events, including comets, meteors, and what might be nova or supernova events. These observations demonstrate that Mesopotamian astronomers paid attention to cosmic catastrophes. Some alternative researchers suggest that this attention reflects cultural memory or direct knowledge of the event that forced the Anunnaki to Earth. But conventional scholars note that any culture developing astronomical expertise would naturally observe and record dramatic celestial phenomena without requiring special explanation. The question of why the Anunnaki came or fled to Earth specifically raises additional puzzles. If they were capable of space travel, why choose this planet? Standard colonization logic might say Earth offered specific resources they needed. Refugee logic would suggest different factors: habitability, relative proximity to their original location, or perhaps simple chance that this was the nearest viable world when catastrophe struck. The texts don't address this directly, leaving interpreters to construct explanations from silence. Modern exoplanet research has identified thousands of worlds orbiting other stars, some potentially habitable. This vastly expands the number of places hypothetical spacefaring refugees might flee to, which paradoxically makes Earth seem less special, unless there were specific reasons for choosing it. Distance calculations matter enormously in this scenario. Even travelling at substantial fractions of light speed, journeys between star systems would take decades or centuries. This constrains how far refugees could realistically flee and still arrive alive, unless of course the Anunnaki originated within our own solar system, making Earth a nearby refuge rather than distant destination. This brings the hypothesis closer to Sitchin's Nibiru scenario, but removes the regular orbital return, instead suggesting one-way evacuation from dying planet within our own stellar neighbourhood. Nibiru wouldn't be on a 600-year orbit, but rather would have been ejected from the solar system or destroyed entirely, leaving only its former inhabitants stranded on Earth. The psychological dimension of the refugee interpretation differs markedly from colonization narratives. Colonizers can view indigenous populations with condescension or indifference, treating them as resources to exploit or obstacles to remove. Refugees fleeing catastrophe might view inhabitants of their new home differently, as fellow survivors of cosmic chance, perhaps worthy of more consideration. This could explain the ambivalence in Sumerian texts, where gods sometimes protect humans, and sometimes seem on the verge of destroying them entirely. Academic scholarship doesn't seriously engage with this refugee hypothesis because it requires accepting extraterrestrial presence in first place, a premise conventional archaeology rejects. The question of whether the Anunnaki were refugees or colonizers only matters if you've already concluded they were actual physical beings rather than mythological constructs. For most scholars, the entire framework of debate sits outside acceptable discourse. But within alternative research communities, the refuge interpretation has gained some traction as potentially explaining textual elements that don't fit neatly into standard ancient astronaut theories. It preserves the core claim that Anunnaki were extraterrestrial, while shifting the emotional and narrative framework from conquest to survival. Whether this represents genuine insight into ancient meaning, or simply another layer of speculation piled onto previous speculation, depends on how you evaluate the entire enterprise of literal readings of mythological texts. The stars above ancient Mesopotamia included some that no longer exist. Supernova events in our galaxy during the past 5,000 years would have created temporary new stars of remarkable brightness, visible even in daylight for weeks or months before fading. Observing such an event would have impressed any culture, possibly finding its way into mythological accounts of cosmic violence and divine conflict. Whether any specific supernova corresponds to specific Mesopotamian myth remains uncertain, but the possibility illustrates how astronomical reality might inspire or reinforce mythological narratives. The escape hypothesis asks us to read ancient texts through lens of cosmic catastrophe and survival. It suggests that beneath the religious and mythological surface, the stories preserve memories of genuine traumatic events, not human trauma, but the trauma of beings who lost their original home and found refuge here. Whether such a reading reveals hidden truth or projects modern concerns about climate catastrophe and refugee crises onto ancient material is a question that can't be definitively answered without evidence that doesn't exist in the current archaeological record. A scribe named Lunana worked in the temple complex at during the reign of Shulgi, around 2050 BCE. His position required him to maintain administrative records, copy religious texts, and occasionally compose commemorative inscriptions for royal building projects. On one particular day, preserved in his own notation on a practice tablet later discovered by archaeologists, he copied a section of the Eridu Genesis, dealing with the creation of humans by the Anunnaki. Lunana sat in the scribal room with 6 other junior priests, each at low desks with clay tablets and reed styluses prepared. Light entered through high windows, sufficient to read by but carefully positioned to avoid direct sunlight that would dry tablets too quickly. The head scribe read aloud from an older tablet, his voice steady and measured, repeating each phrase twice before the students could begin inscribing. The Sumerian words flowed in familiar patterns, Anunnaki ne luulu muun dimeyes, which meant the Anunnaki created humanity. But as Lunana pressed the signs into wet clay, he wondered what the words truly signified. His training had taught him grammar and orthography, but not necessarily meaning. The texts described gods creating humans from clay and blood, but what did that mean? He had seen potters shape vessels from clay along the river bank. He had seen priests sacrifice animals and mix blood with grain for offerings, but creating living beings from these materials, the literal reading seemed impossible. Yet the text presented it as historical fact, events that had occurred in distant past before the founding of cities, before even the first kings ruled in Sumer. The practice tablet he produced that day, marked with his name and date, survived because his room later burned in a fire that baked the clay hard. Modern archaeologists who excavated it could read his careful signs and see the slight variations where his hand had hesitated or corrected errors before the clay dried. The tablet provides no insight into Lunana's private thoughts, only evidence that he copied the text as instructed, maintaining tradition by reproducing words that had been copied countless times before and would be copied countless times after. Textual analysis of Sumerian creation narratives reveals layers of composition and revision. Scholars comparing different versions of the same myths from different time periods can track how stories evolved, which elements remained stable and which changed. The core concept of the Anunnaki as creator gods appears remarkably stable across versions separated by centuries, but specific details vary. The number of Anunnaki involved, the precise mechanism of creation, the reasons given for creating humanity. This variation suggests oral tradition feeding into written tradition. Stories told and retold accumulate regional variations and individual elaborations before anyone writes them down. Once written, they stabilize but not completely. Each new copying provides opportunities for scribes to introduce changes, whether intentional theological reinterpretation or accidental transmission errors. The text we read today in modern translation has passed through multiple such filters before reaching us. The word An in Sumerian means both heaven and serves as the name of the sky god. Ki means earth, and also names the earth goddess. This linguistic overlap between cosmic domains and divine names reflects worldview where heaven and earth weren't just locations but living entities, or where gods weren't beings who lived in heaven but rather were heaven itself in some sense. Understanding this requires thinking outside modern categories that separate geography from theology, matter from spirit. When texts say the Anunnaki came from An, they might mean the sky as physical location, or they might mean they descended from the god An genealogically, or they might be using both meanings simultaneously, through intentional wordplay. Sumerian scribes enjoyed linguistic cleverness, building multiple meanings into single phrases. Modern translators must choose which meaning to emphasize, losing the ambiguity that might have been precisely the point for the original authors. The phrase describing human creation, lualu muan dim, uses the verb dim, which means to create or to fashion. The same verb applies to creating physical objects like tools or buildings. This might support literal reading, where humans were physically assembled, but the verb also applies to abstract creation like establishing laws or creating social order. The ambiguity permits both physical and metaphysical interpretations, perhaps intentionally. Sitchin's translations often choose the most physical, literal reading of such ambiguous terms. Where conventional scholars read metaphor or theological abstraction, he read concrete description of engineering processes. His translation of Tiet as life or rib drew on the word's legitimate double meaning, allowing him to connect the Genesis story of Eve's creation from Adam's rib back to Sumerian sources. Academic scholars argued this represented cherry-picking meanings that supported predetermined conclusions rather than contextual interpretation guided by broader patterns in the language. The question of how to translate ancient texts fairly becomes philosophical. Should translators choose meanings that make sense within conventional worldviews, avoiding interpretations that seem impossible or fantastic? Or should they translate as literally as possible, letting the text say what they say, even if the results seem strange? Should they prioritize linguistic analysis? Or should broader archaeological and historical context guide interpretation when language permits multiple readings? Professional translators argue that context must guide choices when language is ambiguous. A word that could mean either boat or cosmic vehicle should be translated as boat if the passage describes river travel, but might be translated differently if context involves celestial journey. This seems reasonable, but introduces subjective judgment about what contexts are plausible. If you assume gods are mythological, you translate celestial journey language metaphorically. If you assume gods might be extraterrestrial beings, you translate the same language more literally. Comparative linguistics provides some constraints. Scholars can compare how words and phrases are used across many different texts, building understanding of standard usage and identifying when particular texts employ language in unusual ways. This method shows that many of Sitchin's readings choose rare or secondary meanings over common primary meanings without clear contextual justification. His translation of mu as rocket rather than the standard name appears in no academic lexicon and contradicts how the word is used in thousands of other instances. Yet the question persists. Could standard meanings be wrong? Could scribes have been using code words or metaphors to describe technologies they didn't fully understand themselves, relying on inherited vocabularies that originally meant something more literal than later generations realized? The hypothesis is unfalsifiable because any correction toward conventional meaning can be dismissed as evidence of how much literal truth has been lost through layers of reinterpretation. Astronomical content in Sumerian texts provides more testable ground. References to specific star positions, eclipse cycles, and planetary movements can be checked against actual celestial mechanics. When texts describe Venus appearing as evening star for 8 months, disappearing for 3 months, and reappearing as morning star, we can verify whether Venus actually follows that pattern, and it does. This demonstrates accurate observation regardless of whether observers understood the heliocentric model explaining what they saw. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa records observations spanning 21 years of Venus positions. Modern astronomers can work backward to calculate when those specific observations would have been visible, providing dates for the king's reign. The match between textual description and astronomical calculation validates the observations as genuine. It also demonstrates sophisticated understanding of cyclical patterns requiring sustained attention over many generations. But did this understanding extend to heliocentric cosmology? Some cylinder seals appear to show circular arrangement of bodies around a central sphere, which alternative researchers read as evidence of heliocentric knowledge. Academic scholars read the same imagery as mythological diagrams with no connection to physical planetary orbits. The seal images are ambiguous enough to support both readings, particularly since we lack clear textual explanation of what the images meant to their creators. The limits of our understanding become clearer the more closely we examine what has survived. We have fragments, copies of copies, texts preserved by accident of burning or burial. We have no Sumerian informant to ask, "What did you mean by this?" We have only our reconstructions of a dead language, our theories about ancient worldviews, and our assumptions about what's possible, shaping how we interpret ambiguous evidence. Reading between the wedges, trying to extract meaning beyond what's explicitly stated, requires humility about how much we can actually know. The texts preserve words but not tone, content but not context, statements but not the full web of meaning. Those statements existed within. Every translation is partly interpretation, every interpretation partly projection of our own concerns and categories onto materials that operated by different rules. Lunana's practice tablet, with its careful signs describing the Anunnaki creating humanity, sits now in a museum drawer. What he believed about those words, whether he took them literally or understood them symbolically, whether he had doubts or certainties, remains inaccessible. We have his work but not his thoughts, his copying but not his understanding. The wedges in clay outlasted the scribe who pressed them by 4,000 years, but they preserve only part of what he knew, and even less of what he meant. Mesopotamian astronomy achieved precision that still impresses modern researchers. By the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, astronomers were tracking planetary positions with accuracy sufficient to predict phenomena like heliacal risings, the moment when a planet or star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn after a period of invisibility. These predictions required understanding cycles spanning decades and combining observations from multiple sources into coherent mathematical models. The sophistication appears even in early texts. The Mul.apn series, astronomical compendium texts from around 1000 BCE, but based on earlier observations, catalogues fixed stars and constellations, describes planetary movements, and provides calculation methods for calendar corrections. The texts divide the sky into three paths: the path of Anu, Enlil, and Ea, each associated with different bands of declination and containing specific constellation groups. This threefold division served both religious and practical functions, connecting cosmic geography to divine hierarchy, while providing framework for tracking celestial positions. The question of how this knowledge developed raises interesting considerations. Accurate observation requires stability, institutions that persist across generations, methods for recording and transmitting data, social structures that value and reward systematic attention to patterns that unfold slowly. Mesopotamian temple complexes provided exactly these conditions. Priesthoods maintained records across centuries, training apprentices in observational techniques and mathematical methods for processing data. The knowledge accumulated gradually, each generation refining what predecessors had learned. Or did it? Alternative interpretations note the apparent sophistication appearing early in the record, seemingly without long developmental phase. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa from 1600 BCE shows detailed tracking of Venus cycles, but we have little evidence of the centuries of observations that such knowledge presumably required. Either the developmental record is lost, or the knowledge appeared more rapidly than gradual accumulation would predict. This gap feeds speculation about knowledge transfer from external sources, either the Anunnaki directly teaching astronomy, or recovered knowledge from earlier civilizations destroyed by catastrophes. Academic scholarship favors the lost developmental record explanation. Clay tablets survive only under specific conditions. Most texts from most periods have disintegrated, leaving us with tiny sample of what existed. The absence of evidence for early astronomical development doesn't mean such development didn't occur, only that the tablets recording it haven't been found or didn't survive. The sophistication we see in earliest surviving texts likely represents the visible peak of an iceberg whose base has eroded. Mathematical astronomy in Mesopotamia employed base 60 number system, which we still use for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This sexagesimal system has computational advantages for astronomical work, because 60 has many divisors, making fractional calculations more manageable without decimal notation. Whether Mesopotamians developed this system specifically for astronomy or adapted an existing numerical framework to celestial observations remains unclear, but the fit between tool and task is remarkable. Planetary periods, as tracked by Babylonian astronomers, match modern calculations closely. They knew Jupiter's synodic period, time between successive oppositions, as 398.9 days, compared to modern value of 398.88 days. Saturn's synodic period, they calculated as 378.1 days versus modern 378.09. This level of precision required aggregating observations across many cycles and developing mathematical techniques for extracting stable periods from noisy data that included measurement errors, irregular atmospheric effects. Eclipse prediction represents perhaps the highest achievement of Mesopotamian astronomy. The Saros cycle, 223 lunar months spanning approximately 18 years, after which eclipse patterns repeat, was known and used for prediction by at least 600 BCE. Identifying this cycle required noticing that eclipses separated by this specific interval show similar characteristics, then verifying the pattern across multiple cycles. Once identified, the Saros allowed prediction of future eclipses with reasonable accuracy, conferring considerable prestige on priests who could forecast what must have seemed like cosmic omens. The motivation for this astronomical work combined practical and religious elements. Accurate calendars enabled proper scheduling of agricultural activities and religious festivals. Celestial omens required interpretation, and systematic observation made that interpretation more reliable. Kings consulted astrologers before major decisions, wanting to know whether celestial configurations favored their plans. These applications created demand for astronomical expertise and supported the resources needed to maintain observational programs. But some passages in astronomical texts suggest awareness beyond what practical needs would explain. References to stellar parallax, the apparent shift in star positions caused by Earth's movement, have been identified in certain tablets, though the interpretation remains disputed. If Mesopotamian astronomers understood parallax, they might have inferred Earth's motion, potentially implying heliocentric understanding millennia before Copernicus. However, most scholars argue the relevant passages describe different phenomena or have been mistranslated. The connection between astronomy and the Anunnaki appears in various texts. Divine beings are associated with specific celestial objects: Shamash with the sun, Sin with the moon, Ishtar with Venus, Nergal with Mars. Whether this association meant the gods were thought to reside in those celestial bodies, or to manifest through them, or to be them in some fundamental sense, remains ambiguous. The relationship between divine and celestial allowed astronomy and theology to inform each other, observational data about planetary movements becoming information about divine intentions. Alternative researchers point to this conflation as possible evidence of confused memories. If the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings arriving from specific locations in space, association between these beings and particular celestial objects might preserve garbled memory of origin points. Venus as Ishtar's celestial manifestation might encode forgotten knowledge that certain Anunnaki came from Venus or used Venus's orbit in navigation. Such interpretations require substantial speculation beyond what texts explicitly state. The precession of the equinoxes, slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, causing gradual shift in star positions over 26,000-year cycle, may have been known to Mesopotamian astronomers, though direct evidence is limited. Certain star catalogues show positions that seem systematically offset from contemporaneous actual positions, possibly indicating awareness that stellar coordinates change over long timescales. If they recognized precession, it would demonstrate observational programs spanning many centuries and computational methods capable of extracting extremely slow trends from accumulated data. Such long-term astronomical knowledge requires institutional stability. We sometimes underestimate. Tracking precession meaningfully needs observations separated by centuries, which means maintaining records and methods across political upheavals, invasions, cultural transformations. Mesopotamian civilization experienced all these disruptions repeatedly, yet astronomical knowledge seems to have persisted through changes in ruling dynasties, languages of administration, and even religious frameworks. The continuity suggests powerful institutional structures, preserving and transmitting specialized knowledge across generations. The night sky visible from ancient Mesopotamia showed stars we still see, though light pollution makes them less accessible to modern urban observers. The Milky Way stretched overhead in luminous river of light, the zodiacal band, path through constellations where sun, moon and planets move, stood out clearly. Meteor showers arrived on predictable schedules, though individual meteors appeared random. Occasional comets traced their paths across weeks or months, bright enough to see in daylight at peak. These phenomena were observed, recorded, interpreted as omens or divine communications. How much did they understand of the actual physics? Did they know stars were distant suns? Did they conceive of planets as worlds rather than divine lights? The texts don't clearly state such understandings, and most scholars assume Mesopotamian cosmology remained geocentric and qualitative, rather than heliocentric and mathematical. But absence of explicit statements doesn't prove absence of understanding. particularly if knowledge was considered esoteric and restricted to priesthoods who might not commit their deepest insights to texts meant for more general circulation. The astronomical question ultimately asks, what was possible for ancient observers using naked eye observations and mathematical analysis? How much can be deduced about the cosmos from patient watching and careful thought? Mesopotamian astronomy pushed those limits further than we sometimes acknowledge, extracting maximum information from available data through methods that remain impressive when studied carefully. Whether their understanding extended beyond what mainstream scholars recognize into areas we'd consider modern insights remains one of those questions suspended between evidence and interpretation, neither proven nor disproven by the fragmentary records that survived 5,000 years of weathering, conquest, and time's slow erosion of even the hardest-pressed clay. The temple platforms at Uruk rest on foundations that descend through multiple construction phases, each layer buried beneath the next as successive generations built higher. Excavations in the 1920s revealed this stratification levels, separated by fills of clean sand or debris, indicating deliberate covering of older structures before new construction began. The practice created artificial tells, mounds rising above the floodplain through accumulated building episodes spanning centuries. Beneath the White Temple's visible platform lies an earlier structure archaeologists call the Stone Cone Temple, its walls decorated with thousands of small stone cones pressed into clay, plaster to create geometric patterns. This decorative technique required enormous labor, each cone shaped individually, arranged in precise layouts, the whole surface creating mosaic effects when pigments were applied. The hidden surface, buried when later builders raised the platform higher, preserves colors and patterns that weathering would have destroyed if left exposed. Underground chambers appear at several Mesopotamian sites, their functions not always clear from surviving evidence. At Eridu, the temple precinct includes subterranean rooms accessed by stairs descending from surface level. These chambers, constructed with precisely fitted bricks and waterproofed with bitumen coatings, maintained cooler temperatures than surface structures. What rituals occurred in these hidden spaces? Storage seems insufficient explanation for the architectural investment. Perhaps they served as sacred repositories for objects too holy for common view, or as spaces where initiates underwent transformative experiences away from sunlight and daily life. The alignment of major structures shows attention to cardinal directions and celestial phenomena. The ziggurat at Ur, despite being offset 45 degrees from true north, aligns its corners precisely with the cardinal points: northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest. This orientation appears deliberate, maintained across multiple rebuilding phases. Some scholars suggest it relates to prevailing wind patterns, positioning the structure to minimize erosion. Others propose astronomical significance, though the specific celestial target remains debated. Modern remote sensing technologies reveal hidden features invisible to surface inspection. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at Ur detected anomalies beneath the ziggurat's foundation platform, suggesting void spaces or chambers not accessed during earlier excavations. Whether these represent intentional rooms or simply gaps from settlement and decay can't be determined without excavation, which current site preservation concerns prohibit. The unknowns remain beneath the surface, tantalizing possibilities waiting for future investigation with less intrusive methods. Acoustic properties of temple spaces suggest sophisticated understanding of sound behavior. The White Temple's central chamber, with its specific dimensions and hard plaster surfaces, creates distinct resonance patterns. Researchers testing these spaces with reconstructed ancient instruments found that certain frequencies amplified dramatically, while others were absorbed. This might have been an accidental result of construction methods, or it might indicate intentional acoustic engineering, creating environments where ritual chants and music achieved particular effects on participants. The symbolic dimension of buried foundations connects to Mesopotamian concepts of cosmic ordering. Creation myths describe divine beings establishing the world by driving cosmic pegs into primordial chaos, fixing Earth's position, and preventing return to formlessness. Temple foundations might have been understood as literal manifestations of this mythological action, sacred architecture, anchoring cosmic order through physical penetration into Earth. The deeper the foundation, the more securely the temple fulfilled its function as axis, connecting heaven, earth, and underworld. Hidden inscriptions appear in foundation deposits where they could never be read by human eyes after placement. Clay cylinders or stone tablets inscribed with dedications were buried in corners or beneath thresholds during construction, dedicating the building to specific deities and recording the king's pious act of temple building. These texts weren't meant for human audiences, but for divine readers, or perhaps for future archaeologists who would eventually uncover them, though that possibility seems unlikely to have motivated ancient builders. The silence beneath the platforms holds memories of construction. Thousands of workers carrying mud bricks, arranging them in patterns directed by master builders, maintaining precise levels and angles through methods we partially understand. Plumbobs and water levels provided simple but effective surveying tools. Measuring rods standardized dimensions, reference points established alignments. The technology was basic but sufficient when applied with care and patience across years of sustained labor. What technologies might have been used but left no trace? Organic materials decay completely in most conditions. Wooden scaffolding, rope and pulley systems, leather harnesses for moving heavy stones, all would vanish, leaving only the results of their use as indirect evidence. The absence of sophisticated tools in archaeological deposits doesn't prove such tools didn't exist, only that they haven't survived or haven't been recognized in the fragmentary assemblages we've recovered. Alternative researchers sometimes point to precision in ancient construction as evidence of lost technologies beyond what conventional archaeology recognizes. Stone blocks fitted with minimal gaps, surfaces polished to mirror finishes, massive weights moved over considerable distances. These achievements seem to exceed capabilities of simple tools and muscle power, yet experimental archaeology has demonstrated that patient application of basic techniques can accomplish remarkable results. The question becomes, do we underestimate ancient capabilities, or do anomalies genuinely indicate missing knowledge? The hidden dimensions beneath Mesopotamian temples include both physical spaces we haven't fully explored and conceptual dimensions we struggle to reconstruct. The builders operated within worldviews that didn't separate sacred from secular, symbolic from functional, earthly from cosmic. Their architecture embodied these integrations in ways that our categories sometimes obscure. Beneath the visible ruins lie foundations both literal and metaphorical, supporting structures whose full significance we're still working to understand 5,000 years after construction. Cylinder seals carved from hard stones present interesting technical challenges. The miniature scenes wrap around cylinders, typically 2 4 centimeters long and 1 2 centimeters in diameter, with details fine enough to show individual facial features, textile patterns, and complex symbolic elements. Creating such precise carving in materials like hematite or lapis lazuli, using copper tools available in the Bronze Age, seems difficult, though not impossible. Experimental replication efforts have produced cylinder seals using reconstructed ancient tools, copper points, abrasive powders, bow drills for creating rotation. The process requires considerable time and skill. A single seal might take weeks of patient work, repeatedly sharpening tools, applying abrasive slurries, checking progress against design intentions. That ancient craftspeople invested this effort seems plausible given the seal's importance as signatures and status markers. Yet some surviving examples show precision that even expert modern replicators struggle to match. The materials themselves raise questions. Lapis lazuli sourced from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus region, obsidian from Anatolia. These stones traveled thousands of kilometers to Mesopotamian workshops. The trade networks implied by material distributions indicate complex economic relationships spanning vast distances. How were these networks established and maintained? What motivated people to transport heavy, valuable materials across difficult terrain before domestication of camels made desert crossing more feasible? Metallurgical analysis of bronze objects reveals sophisticated alloying techniques. The ratio of copper to tin affects the metal's properties. Higher tin content increases hardness, but reduces ductility. Bronze tools found in archaeological contexts show variations suggesting intentional adjustment of alloy composition for different applications. This knowledge required experimentation, observation of results, and transmission of successful formulas across generations. The metallurgy was empirical rather than theoretical, but no less effective for that. Some artifacts seem anomalous within their archaeological contexts. The so-called Baghdad battery, clay jars from Parthian period containing copper cylinders and iron rods, might have functioned as electrochemical cells if filled with acidic solution. Mainstream archaeology interprets them as storage vessels for sacred scrolls, the metal components serving as protective casings rather than electrical apparatus. Alternative researchers argue they demonstrate ancient knowledge of electrochemistry used for electroplating or other purposes conventional scholarship doesn't recognize. The debate illustrates broader tensions in archaeological interpretation. When do we expand our understanding of ancient capabilities to accommodate puzzling evidence, and when do we favor conventional explanations, even if they leave some details unexplained? Both approaches carry risks. Expanding too readily leads to unsupported speculation, while rigid conservatism might miss genuine discoveries about ancient knowledge. Astronomical instruments pose similar questions. Later Mesopotamian texts describe devices for measuring angles and tracking celestial positions, but physical examples rarely survive. Were sophisticated observational tools employed that archaeology hasn't recognized, or did naked-eye observations combined with geometric methods achieve the documented precision? The resolution matters because it affects our understanding of how ancient astronomy functioned and what knowledge supported it. Stone vases carved from single blocks of hard stone, some with walls less than a centimeter thick, demonstrate remarkable control. Creating such objects through pecking and grinding with available tools seems feasible, but extraordinarily time-consuming. Perhaps the investment reflects cultural values, placing premium on craftsmanship and permanence. Or perhaps techniques existed that reduced labor requirements, but haven't been identified in the archaeological record. The absence of evidence creates interpretive space that alternative archaeology exploits. If we haven't found the tools or workshops where certain objects were made, maybe conventional understanding of available technology is incomplete. Maybe knowledge was lost in ways that erased not just the information, but the physical traces that would normally survive. This reasoning can justify almost any claim about lost technologies, which is precisely why mainstream archaeology treats it with skepticism. Yet genuine mysteries persist. The precision of some astronomical observations exceeds what we'd expect from the instruments and methods we can document. The sophistication of mathematical texts appears suddenly in the record, without clear developmental trajectory. Some architectural achievements seem to require organizational capabilities and technical knowledge whose origins remain obscure. These gaps don't necessarily indicate lost advanced civilizations or extraterrestrial intervention, but they do suggest our understanding remains incomplete. The technology debates ultimately reflect different standards for accepting claims. Mainstream archaeology requires multiple independent lines of evidence before accepting significant revisions to established understanding. Alternative archaeology privileges anomalies and unexplained details, arguing that orthodox frameworks dismiss or rationalize evidence that doesn't fit comfortable narratives. The gap between these approaches is philosophical as much as empirical, involving questions about burden of proof, standards for inference, and what constitutes adequate explanation. The artifacts themselves remain neutral in these debates, neither confirming nor denying the theories built around them. A precisely carved cylinder seal is just that, regardless of whether we think it demonstrates expected capabilities or indicates hidden knowledge. The seal exists, survives, shows certain measurable properties. What those properties imply about the craftsperson who made it, the society that valued it, and the knowledge base that enabled its creation remains partly a matter of interpretation, shaped by our broader assumptions about what ancient peoples could and did know. The winged disc appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian art, a circular form flanked by stylized wings and often containing divine figures or symbolic elements. Mainstream interpretation reads this as representation of the sun god Shamash, or symbol of divine protection and cosmic order. Alternative readings suggest it depicts actual craft or technology, the wings indicating flight capability, rather than symbolic heavenly associations. The ambiguity in the imagery permits both interpretations without definitive resolution. Star symbols accompany deity representations throughout Mesopotamian iconography, establishing clear associations between specific gods and celestial objects. The eight-pointed star marks Ishtar and Venus. The crescent indicates Sin and the moon. The sun disk represents Shamash. These associations weren't merely symbolic attributions, but reflected genuine astronomical observation. Venus's brilliance and distinctive appearance patterns, the moon's phases and cycles, the sun's central importance to life and agriculture. The question of what these associations meant to ancient observers remains partly inaccessible. Did they understand the celestial objects as divine beings themselves, or as manifestations or dwelling places of gods whose essential nature transcended physical form? The texts don't clearly articulate metaphysical distinctions we might make between symbolic representation and literal identity. Perhaps the question itself imposes categories foreign to Mesopotamian thought. Cylinder seals sometimes show scenes that challenge straightforward interpretation. One famous example depicts what appears to be a central spherical object, surrounded by smaller circles in orbital arrangement. Alternative researchers read this as a diagram of the solar system showing heliocentric understanding. Conventional scholars interpret it as mythological representation of cosmic ordering, with no connection to actual astronomical models. The image itself doesn't specify which reading is correct, leaving both possibilities open. The tree of life motif appears across Mesopotamian art, a stylized plant form often flanked by divine or guardian figures. This symbol carries multiple layers of meaning: agricultural abundance, divine blessing, connection between earthly and celestial realms, perhaps encoded information about sacred plants or astronomical cycles. Attempts to decode precise meanings from these images must contend with the reality that symbolic systems rarely translate directly into propositional statements. The symbols communicated something to their original audiences, but reconstructing that communication across millennia requires informed speculation. Sacred numbers recur through Mesopotamian texts and architecture. 7 appears frequently: 7 sages, 7 gates, 7 tablets of creation. 60 serves as numerical base with significant ritual importance. 12 marks zodiacal divisions and calendrical structures. 3,600, the square of 60, carries special significance in astronomical texts and possibly in references to divine timescales or cosmic cycles. Whether these numbers held purely symbolic value or encoded actual observations and calculations remains debated. The ziggurat form itself embodies cosmological concepts. These stepped pyramids connected 3 cosmic realms: underworld below, earth at middle levels, heaven at summit. Ascending the ziggurat meant moving through these zones toward divine presence at the top. The architectural form made mythological geography physically traversable, transforming abstract cosmology into concrete spatial experience. Modern astronomical analysis contests some claims about ancient sky knowledge. When texts describe specific stellar configurations or planetary positions, researchers can calculate whether those configurations actually occurred when the texts claim. Generally, these checks validate Mesopotamian observations as accurate, demonstrating genuine astronomical competence. Occasional mismatches might indicate copying errors in transmission, observation mistakes, or our misunderstanding of what the texts describe. The phenomenon of heliacal rising, when a star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn after a period of invisibility, was carefully tracked by Mesopotamian astronomers. These observations served both practical purposes for calendar regulation and symbolic purposes, connecting celestial cycles to agricultural and ritual calendars. The precision of tracking required understanding how Earth's orbital position affects which stars are visible when, knowledge that could be accumulated empirically without theoretical understanding of heliocentric mechanics. Alternative interpretations of astronomical content sometimes read advanced knowledge into texts, where conventional scholars see observational records. Claims that Mesopotamians knew about planets beyond Saturn, invisible to naked eye, rest on debated translations of ambiguous references in late astronomical texts. The most generous reading suggests they might have recorded observations of Uranus during rare optimal visibility conditions, but this remains speculative. The silence of the night sky offered ancient observers clarity impossible in modern light-polluted environments. On moonless nights far from cities, the Milky Way casts shadows and thousands of stars become visible. Planets shine steadily, while stars twinkle from atmospheric turbulence. Meteor showers arrive on predictable schedules. Patient watching over many nights reveals patterns. Planets moving through constellations, some reversing direction in retrograde loops, others maintaining steady progress along the ecliptic. What wisdom did they extract from this watching? The astronomical texts preserve calculations and observations, but the metaphysical framework integrating this knowledge into broader worldview comes through less clearly. Stars were divine, or associated with divine beings, or signs through which divine will communicated to humanity. Understanding celestial mechanics and reading celestial omens weren't separate activities, but aspects of unified endeavor, seeking to comprehend cosmic order and humanity's place within it. The symbols and astronomical knowledge work together, each reinforcing the other. Observation of Venus's patterns confirmed mythological associations with Ishtar. Mythological narratives about divine conflicts might encode observations of planetary conjunctions or celestial events. The line between recording what was seen and interpreting what it meant was probably less distinct than our categories suggest, with observation and meaning-making flowing together in integrated understanding. Beneath the symbols lies the patient accumulation of observation across generations, the refinement of mathematical methods for extracting patterns from apparent irregularities, and the construction of worldviews that made sense of human experience in a cosmos vast and mysterious. What they knew, how they knew it, and what they believed about what they knew. These questions remain partly open despite the thousands of tablets and images that survived 5,000 years, waiting for modern interpreters to puzzle over them with tools and assumptions the ancient astronomers never imagined. Academic archaeology reads the Anunnaki as mythological constructs, divine beings invented by Sumerian culture to explain cosmic origins and justify social hierarchies. This interpretation rests on comparative religious studies, showing that virtually all cultures develop creation myths featuring supernatural beings who establish world order and create humanity. The Mesopotamian version follows recognizable patterns: primordial chaos, divine conflicts, separation of elements, creation of humans to serve gods. Nothing in this framework requires actual divine or extraterrestrial beings, only human imagination working to make sense of existence. Ancient astronaut theorists read the same texts as historical accounts of extraterrestrial contact, arguing that primitive peoples encountered advanced beings and recorded these encounters as best they could using available conceptual frameworks. When texts describe gods descending from heaven in celestial boats, alternative interpretation sees spacecraft. When myths mention genetic mixing to create humans, this reading finds ancient memory of biological engineering. The framework assumes ancient peoples were accurate observers reporting real events, even if their understanding of those events was incomplete. Some scholars occupy middle positions, suggesting that mythology might preserve kernels of historical memory even if the narratives as preserved are largely imaginative. Perhaps catastrophic events like major floods inspired flood myths that were then elaborated into cosmic dramas featuring divine actors. Perhaps encounters between different human populations with varying technological levels created memories of more advanced gods, helping or exploiting less developed peoples. These intermediate positions acknowledge that myths can have historical roots without accepting literal extraterrestrial interpretations. The debate often focuses on specific details that seem anomalous under conventional frameworks. How did Sumerians develop sophisticated astronomy so rapidly? Why do their king lists describe impossibly long reigns before the flood? What explains apparent similarities between Mesopotamian myths and creation stories from distant cultures that supposedly had no contact? Each anomaly gets addressed differently depending on interpretative framework, as coincidence, as evidence of lost knowledge, as misunderstanding of what texts actually claim, or as proof of intervention from external sources. Mainstream scholarship emphasizes gradual cultural development. The sophistication visible in earliest surviving texts reflects long oral traditions that preceded writing by centuries or millennia. The astronomical knowledge crystallized from generations of patient observation. The mathematical concepts emerged through practical needs in administration and trade. Nothing requires sudden intervention or knowledge transfer from advanced beings. Human ingenuity, given sufficient time and appropriate conditions, can explain observed achievements. Alternative researchers counter that conventional explanations often amount to asserting that anomalies aren't really anomalous. When precision astronomical observations appear in early texts without documented developmental history, saying the development must have occurred but wasn't recorded, sounds like argument from absence. When king lists describe Dreißig, 000 year reigns, dismissing these as symbolic or corrupted, rather than considering what they might actually represent, seems predetermined by assumptions about what's possible. The question of translation remains central. Both sides acknowledge that Sumerian is difficult language requiring expert knowledge to read accurately, but they disagree about whether expert consensus should be trusted or whether outsider perspectives might catch meanings specialists have overlooked through overfamiliarity. Sitchin's lack of formal credentials in Assyriology works against him in academic evaluation, but becomes badge of independence in alternative communities. Conversely, professional Sumerologists' unanimous rejection of his translations carries weight in academic circles, but might be dismissed as institutional gatekeeping by those predisposed toward alternative interpretations. Cross-cultural patterns in mythology present interesting evidence. Flood narratives appear across many ancient cultures: Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, various Native American traditions. Mainstream explanation points to floods being common catastrophic events that any river valley civilization would experience and mythologize. Alternative interpretation suggests these stories preserve global memory of actual worldwide deluge, perhaps connected to ice age melting, cometary impact, or other catastrophic event affecting multiple regions simultaneously. Creation myths involving divine beings, fashioning humans from earth materials, appear in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Mesoamerica, and elsewhere. Conventional reading sees this as natural metaphor for human origins. We come from Earth, return to Earth, are shaped by forces beyond our control. Alternative reading asks whether this widespread motif might reflect shared memory of actual genetic engineering, the clay representing biological material, and divine breath, representing insertion of genetic information from advanced beings. The patterns could support either interpretation. Humans across cultures face similar existential questions, and might independently develop similar narrative solutions, or widespread patterns might indicate diffusion from common source. Whether that source is lost advanced civilization, extraterrestrial visitors sharing knowledge globally, or simply very ancient human culture before regional differentiation, whose mythology spread to daughter cultures. We may never definitively settle these debates because they rest on fundamentally different assumptions about what's possible and what kinds of evidence count. For someone who believes extraterrestrial visitation is plausible or likely, given the age and size of the universe, Ancient texts describing beings from heaven become potential evidence worth taking seriously. For someone who considers such visitation extremely unlikely or impossible, the same texts must be mythology regardless of specific content. Perhaps the inability to prove one interpretation definitively correct serves a purpose. The mystery keeps us engaged with these ancient voices, returning to the tablets, re-examining the evidence, refining our understanding of what they actually say, even if we can't agree on what they mean. The questions outlive the questioners, each generation bringing fresh perspectives and assumptions to materials that remain stubbornly open to multiple readings. The Anunnaki persist in these competing narratives. Gods or aliens, myths or memories, symbols or historical figures, what they were to those who first pressed their names into wet clay, we can only approximate from our distant vantage point, separated by time and worldview from the scribes who knew without question what the words meant, because they lived within the culture that created them. The gaps in our understanding begin with the most basic fact. We have lost most of what was written. Estimates suggest fewer than 1% of ancient Mesopotamian tablets have survived to modern times. The rest dissolved in rain, were crushed under collapsed buildings, were burned in conquests, or simply wore away through exposure to elements over millennia. Within that vanished 99% might be text that would clarify everything we currently debate, or text that would deepen mysteries by revealing how much we've misunderstood. The Library of Ashurbanipal, at Nineveh, contained perhaps 30,000 tablets when Assyrian capital fell in 612 BCE. Invading armies burned the palace, and while the fire accidentally preserved some tablets by baking them hard, most were lost. What astronomical treatises, historical records, ritual instructions, and mythological narratives perished in that destruction? We can only guess based on fragmentary catalogue lists that survived, themselves incomplete and damaged. Oral traditions that predated writing carried knowledge we can never fully recover. The stories eventually written down were perhaps selected from much larger repertoires, with selection criteria unknown to us. Maybe the most sacred knowledge remained oral, deliberately not committed to clay because writing would profane it or make it accessible to those not initiated. This would leave our textual record systematically biased toward less esoteric content, with the deepest truths staying in memory chains that broke when the last initiated practitioners died. We cannot know the internal experiences of ancient believers. When a priest invoked the Anunnaki in ritual, what did he feel or sense? When a scribe copied creation texts, did he understand them as literal history, as metaphorical truth, or in categories we don't have words for? The phenomenology of ancient religious experience is largely inaccessible to us. We have texts describing rituals but not the consciousness of practitioners during those rituals. The question of what the Sumerians actually saw or experienced when they spoke of divine beings remains open. If we assume they were reporting real encounters, were those encounters with physical beings, visionary experiences induced by ritual practices or substances, or something else entirely? Different spiritual and psychological frameworks would interpret the same reports differently. A materialist assumes hallucination or fabrication. A religious believer might accept divine visitation within their theological framework. A ufologist reads extraterrestrial contact. The reports themselves don't specify which interpretation matches what actually occurred. Translation ambiguities multiply when dealing with religious and mythological language. Modern translators must choose English words for Sumerian concepts that might not map neatly to our categories. Heaven, for An, captures some meaning but potentially loses nuances. Create for Dim works generally, but might miss specific connotations. Every translation is already interpretation, and comparing multiple scholarly translations of the same text often reveals significant differences in how passages are understood. Some questions appear genuinely unanswerable with available evidence. Did the Sumerians understand their astronomical observations in terms of anything resembling heliocentric model? The evidence permits both positive and negative answers. Did they possess lost technologies that archaeology hasn't recognized? We can't prove they didn't, but we also can't prove they did, based on absence of evidence. Was their mythology based on historical events, purely imaginative creation, or some complex mixture? Different analytical frameworks produce different conclusions. The nature of proof itself becomes problematic in these debates. What would constitute definitive evidence for ancient astronaut intervention? A spacecraft buried under a Mesopotamian city would do it. But absent such dramatic discovery, we work with ambiguous evidence, text that can be read multiple ways, artifacts whose creation methods are uncertain, astronomical knowledge that might be explained through either indigenous development or external teaching. Neither side can fully prove its case, only argue its interpretation is more plausible. Perhaps some knowledge was deliberately hidden or encoded, Mystery traditions in many cultures restrict certain teachings to initiates who demonstrate readiness. If Mesopotamian priesthoods operated similarly, temple archives might have contained public texts and secret texts, with the latter destroyed, lost, or so encoded that we can't recognize them, even if we have them. Esoteric traditions often use symbolic language that appears nonsensical to outsiders, but conveys specific meanings to initiated readers. The possibility of deliberate obfuscation complicates interpretation further. If texts were written to conceal as much as reveal, straightforward reading might miss the point entirely. Alternative researchers sometimes argue that conventional scholars take mythological language too literally as mythology, missing literal meanings hidden in symbolic forms. But this reasoning can justify reading anything into texts, seeing hidden meanings that might not actually be there. We may never know whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, metaphors, or historical humans elevated to divine status over generations of mythologizing. The evidence that might settle the question conclusively may not exist, or may be buried in sites we haven't excavated, or among tablets we haven't yet deciphered. New discoveries occasionally shift understanding. Dead languages get decoded, lost sites get found, new analytical techniques extract information from old materials. But it's equally possible that certain questions will remain forever beyond definitive resolution. The comfort of mystery, if comfort can be found there, is that the questions remain alive. Each generation approaches the Sumerian texts fresh, bringing new tools and perspectives. What seems impossible to prove in one era might become demonstrable in another, as methods improve and knowledge accumulates. Or perhaps we'll come to accept that some uncertainties are fundamental, that distance in time creates gaps no amount of scholarship can fully bridge. The clay tablets rest in their climate-controlled storage, holding their secrets with the same patience they've maintained for 5,000 years. What they meant to those who wrote them, we approximate. What they mean to us changes as we change. The gap between those meanings, original and contemporary, might be the most honest acknowledgement we can make about our relationship with these ancient voices, speaking across such vast removes of time and cultural difference. When Sumerian civilization faded, its knowledge didn't vanish completely. The Akkadians, who dominated Mesopotamia after 2300 BCE, inherited Sumerian learning, preserving texts in bilingual versions that paired Sumerian with Akkadian translations. Scribal schools continued teaching Sumerian as scholarly language long after it ceased being spoken in daily life, much as Latin persisted in medieval Europe, centuries after the Roman Empire collapsed. This deliberate preservation meant that stories of the Anunnaki, creation myths, astronomical observations, and mathematical techniques passed to successor cultures. The Babylonians carried the tradition forward, copying Sumerian texts and elaborating on them. The creation epic Enuma Elish, composed around 1100 BCE, builds on earlier Sumerian cosmology, while promoting Marduk to supreme position among gods. The astronomical knowledge refined through Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods produced increasingly precise planetary tables and eclipse predictions. Even as political powers changed and languages shifted, the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization flowed through time in an unbroken stream, maintained by institutional continuity of priesthoods and scribal guilds. Greek scholars who travelled east during Hellenistic period encountered this knowledge and brought elements home. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek around 280 BCE, transmitted Mesopotamian traditions to Mediterranean world. His works, now lost but quoted by later authors, included creation narratives and king lists that preserved Sumerian traditions even as original sources became less accessible. Through such channels, fragments of Mesopotamian learning reached Greek astronomy and mathematics, influencing developments that would shape Western science. Biblical traditions absorbed Mesopotamian narratives, transforming polytheistic myths into monotheistic theology. The Genesis flood account echoes Sumerian and Akkadian predecessors with remarkable specificity: instructions to build a boat, gathering animals, sending birds to test for dry land. Abraham's origin in Ur of the Chaldees connects biblical tradition directly to Mesopotamian geography. Whether these connections reflect historical migration, cultural borrowing, or common responses to similar experiences, they ensured that echoes of Sumerian thought reached audiences far removed in time and space from the original contexts. The long silence began when cuneiform ceased being written around 100 CE, the last tablets pressed by priests in Babylonia, before the tradition finally died. For 17 centuries, no one could read the wedge-shaped marks covering thousands of tablets buried across Mesopotamia. The cities became tells, mounds of accumulated debris hiding ruined architecture and forgotten texts. Travelers occasionally noticed strange inscriptions on exposed stones, but couldn't decipher them. The knowledge seemed lost absolutely, recoverable only if someone could break the code separating visible signs from vanished meanings. The breakthrough came through Persian royal inscriptions at Behistun, where Darius the Great had carved trilingual texts in Old Persian, Elamite and Akkadian. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer and scholar, copied these inscriptions in the 1830s and 40s, using known Old Persian to unlock Akkadian, which eventually opened pathways to reading Sumerian. Each decipherment built on previous work, generations of scholars gradually reconstructing grammatical rules and vocabulary from texts that yielded their meanings slowly, reluctantly, one sign at a time. Even now, new tablets emerge from museum storage or clandestine excavations, adding pieces to incomplete puzzles. Archaeologists working in Iraq when security permits continue uncovering sites that expand understanding of Mesopotamian civilization. Digital photography and imaging techniques reveal details on worn tablets that earlier scholars couldn't read. Collaborative databases allow researchers worldwide to compare texts, identifying connections across materials scattered in dozens of institutions. The recovery of this knowledge continues, each discovery potentially shifting interpretation. The questions that captivated Sitchin and alternative researchers still generate books, documentaries, and online debates. Academic conferences still address Sumerian astronomy, mathematics, and religion. Museums mount exhibitions showing artifacts to audiences fascinated by civilization that invented writing and built first cities. The conversation between ancient Mesopotamia and modern world remains active, sustained by continued archaeological work and renewed interest in how early civilizations understood cosmos and humanity's place within it. Still today, the astronomical observations recorded by Babylonian priests inform modern understanding of ancient sky phenomena. Researchers working to establish precise chronologies for ancient Near Eastern history use eclipse records from cuneiform tablets, checking ancient reports against modern calculations. The mathematics developed in Mesopotamia underlies aspects of how we measure time and angles. The base 60 system lives on in our 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours, direct inheritance from Sumerian mathematics surviving 5,000 years of cultural transformation. The tablets themselves continue their patient existence in climate-controlled repositories, each one a direct physical link to the hands that shaped it, the mind that composed its text, the world that valued it enough to preserve it. New analytical techniques, DNA analysis of organic residues, isotopic studies of clay sources, advanced imaging of worn surfaces, extract information earlier generations of scholars couldn't access. The texts keep yielding new knowledge to those willing to study them with appropriate tools and sufficient patience. What the Anunnaki meant to ancient Sumerians remains partly mysterious, but that they meant something profound is undeniable. The stories were important enough to copy across centuries, to preserve in multiple versions, to integrate into broader cosmological and theological frameworks that shaped how civilizations understood existence. Whether those stories described gods, recorded encounters with advanced beings, or expressed deep truths through mythological language, they carried weight that time has not entirely eroded. The legacy flows forward into us, the listeners seeking understanding across vast temporal distance. We're connected to those ancient observers through unbroken lineage of curiosity. The same questions they asked still troubling our sleep. Where do we come from? What forces shaped us? What hidden knowledge might past hold? The answers they offered, preserved in wedge marks pressed into clay, still speak if we're willing to listen patiently, humbly, without demanding certainty where the evidence permits only wonder. The stars they watched continue their courses overhead, unchanged by civilizations rising and falling beneath them. The questions they asked echo in ours, and somewhere in the tension between what we know and what we can never know lies the space where genuine encounter with the past becomes possible, not as certainty, but as relationship, not as settled truth, but as ongoing conversation between then and now, between their voices and our listening, between the mysteries they lived within and the mysteries we still inhabit. The room where you're listening has grown quieter during this journey, or perhaps you've simply become more aware of the quiet that was always there. Traffic sounds if you're in a city, night insects if you're somewhere darker, or maybe just the sound of your own breathing. Slower now than when we began. The world continues its patient turning, indifferent to whether we've solved the mystery of the Anunnaki or left it suspended in the space between competing interpretations. In southern Iraq, the tells still rise from desert plains, mounds marking where cities once flourished. Wind moves across their surfaces, the way it has for millennia since the last inhabitants departed, carrying sand that gradually reshapes contours while revealing and concealing fragments that erosion brings to light or buries deeper. The tablets rest in their scattered locations, some in museum drawers, some still beneath unexcavated ruins, holding the same words they've held since the day they were pressed into clay and dried hard under Mesopotamian sun. The stars above those ruins wheel through the same patterns the Sumerian astronomers tracked with such care. Venus still appears as morning and evening star, following the cycle that made it sacred to Ishtar. The Pleiades still rise in late spring. Orion's belt still marks the celestial equator. Whatever the Anunnaki were, whatever they meant to those who named them, the sky they were said to descend from continues its ancient dance, unmoved by our questions and uncertainties about beings who may have watched those same stars with understanding we can only approximate. The questions we've explored tonight, whether the tablets describe mythology or history, whether the Anunnaki were gods or visitors or metaphors for forces the Sumerians experienced but couldn't otherwise name, these questions will likely persist for as long as people find the ancient text compelling. Perhaps that's appropriate. Not every mystery yields to investigation. Some endure not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence permits multiple interpretations, each coherent within its own framework of assumptions about what's possible in a universe larger and stranger than any single worldview can encompass. There's something peaceful in accepting that we might not know, that the certainty we sometimes crave may not be available when we're trying to understand voices from 5,000 years ago speaking from within worldviews that organized reality differently than ours. The clay tablets don't require us to solve them. They simply exist, patient as the stone they're made from, holding their meanings loosely enough that each generation can approach them fresh and find something worth contemplating in the spaces between wedge marks. Sleep, when it comes, will carry you through hours that pass whether we mark them or not. The same way centuries passed while the tablets lay buried beneath accumulated sand and time, the mystery remains mystery. The stars continue their courses. The wind still moves over ruins where people once pressed reeds into clay and wondered about the beings they called Anunnaki. Those who from heaven to earth came, or fled, or were imagined, or were remembered imperfectly, across the vast distance that separates their clay from our curiosity. Somewhere between the stories they told and the questions we ask lies a truth we approach but never quite reach. Partial, fragmentary, preserved in signs whose meaning shifts subtly each time we read them. And that's enough. More than enough. The not knowing doesn't diminish the wonder but deepens it, leaves space for imagination and interpretation, and the ongoing conversation between past and present that makes the ancient world feel close enough to touch across gulfs of time that should make such touching impossible. Rest now in that space between questions and answers, between ancient voices and modern listening, between the certainty that the tablets exist and the uncertainty about what they ultimately mean, the stillness where breath slows and thought dissolves into something quieter than interpretation, where the wedge marks in clay continue their patient vigil through darkness, unchanged by our presence or absence, holding their secrets and their stories beneath stars that neither confirm nor deny what the Anunnaki were, only watching, as they've always watched, as wind and sand and time continue the slow work of remembering and forgetting, while you settle deeper into quiet, into sleep, into the ancient darkness that holds us all.